You wake up in the early spring of 536 AD in a small wooden dwelling near the edge of a Saxon settlement in what is now southern Germany. Normally by this time of year, the frost begins to lift and the sun shines longer each day, coaxing new life from the frozen ground. But this morning, like yesterday, and the day before, the sky was grey, not with clouds, but with something thicker. A dull, dry fog clings to the earth like the breath of something ancient, suffocating the light. You haven't seen a clear sunrise in months. No one has. The old folks speak of omens. The sky has been bluish-white, they say. Some call it the breath of Woden, others blame Christian sorcery. The truth is more mysterious and more frightening. You do not yet know that something catastrophic has happened far away, something that the entire world will come to feel. Across Europe in the year 536 AD, strange phenomena were recorded by monks, merchants, and kings. Cassiodorus, the Roman statesman serving in the Ostrogothic court in Ravenna, writes about a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. The crops are failing, animals are sickly, the rivers are sluggish and strange. But what could cause such a thing? In Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, the Emperor Justinian I rules in anxious splendor. His court is surrounded by marble and incense, but even the mighty cannot keep out the cold. Procopius, a Byzantine historian, records that during this year a most dreadful portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness. Across Europe, the sun seems to have dimmed. It rises pale and sets early, casting no warmth, no clarity, and little hope. Crops wither under the strange twilight. By midsummer, famine whispers through the villages of Gaul, the forests of Germania, and the highlands of Britannia. The cause, unknown to all at the time, is likely a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps even two. Modern scholars, using ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica, have detected a sharp spike in atmospheric sulfate particles dated precisely to 536 AD. This suggests that somewhere, possibly in Iceland or Central America, a volcanic blast ejected millions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, shrouding the earth in a veil that would last for nearly 2 years. But to those alive then, there was no scientific explanation, just long, dark days, a slow, lingering cold, livestock miss. Children grow pale. In the British Isles, where remnants of Roman rule had long since fractured into warlord kingdoms and patchwork allegiances, the cold causes further chaos. Hill forts that had held out against invaders now find themselves emptying, not from war but from starvation. The soil no longer yields. Grain silos run dry. Trade falters. People begin to move, hoping to find better lands, warmer climate, or at least rumors of food. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster recorded a failure of bread in 536. That failure, a brief line in an old chronicle, hints at catastrophe, a famine, one that would spread far beyond the island. But the worst is still to come. The year continues, the harvest fails, the rivers seem lower, as if the earth itself were weakening. In your Saxon village, people eat thin gruel made from old oats, bitter roots, and tree bark. Some chew on leather or boil old bones to extract the last bit of nourishment. The smell of smoke hangs permanently in the air, not just from hearth fires but from the distant burning of villages, raided by those desperate for food. By late 536, death became commonplace. Graves dot the hillsides, forests grow eerily quiet, wolves howl closer and closer to settlements. Unafraid, there are fewer people to fear. Still, no one understands what is happening. There are no newspapers, no global networks, no weather reports. Rumors pass slowly by traders, by monks, by whispered prayer. In some places, religion surges in popularity. In others, it is rejected entirely. What god, some ask, could allow the sky to go dark and the children to starve? And yet life continues. People dig deeper into frozen ground, wrap their clothes tighter, and ration food more carefully. The church calendar moves forward. Easter still arrives, though its colors are muted. The seasons are harder to track. You forget what time of year it is. The ashes of this year would settle over the next century of history. The societies struggling through 536 are not aware that they are living through the beginning of what scholars now call the late antique Little Ice Age, a time of cooling, collapse, and transformation that would touch the entire world. But back then, for you, all that matters is that the firewood pile is low, the stores are nearly empty, and the sun, that once bright star, now barely rises beyond the trees. What will happen when the stores run out? Famine and fear. You've survived the worst of the winter. It's now the early months of 537 AD. and still the sun has not returned to its former self. You rise from your pallet of straw, wrapped in a woolen blanket thinned by constant use. You step outside your wooden hut and notice the frost still clings to the grass, unusual for what should be a thawing season. The days are longer now, yes, but no brighter. The sky remains that sickly grey-white, and the cold is no longer biting, but persistent, like a damp illness that never leaves. Across Europe, the same story unfolds. What had started as a strange atmospheric phenomenon in 536 has now become a full-blown climate disaster. Historians would later piece together the facts from far-flung corners of the globe. Volcanic eruptions, one in 536, another possibly in 540, released a veil of dust and sulfur that wrapped around the planet, disrupting weather patterns, blocking sunlight, and triggering what we now understand as a brief but intense global cooling event. But for those living in it, there is no such knowledge. There are only the symptoms. In the rural settlements of the Frankish kingdom, fields lay dormant, barley and wheat are sickly, the stalks stunted. Entire villages report that crops have failed for a second year in a row. In some regions, seed grain meant to be planted has already been eaten in desperation. When next year comes, there will be nothing left to grow. As the food supply vanishes, famine tightens its grip. You see it in the bodies of your neighbors. Their skin hangs looser, eyes sunken. Children are unusually quiet, not out of discipline, but from weakness. Illness follows naturally. A simple cough lingers, becomes a fever, and then turns fatal. The weakened population falls victim to ailments that, in better times, would pass. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom is still reeling from internal instability. King Theodahad has taken the throne after the death of Theodoric the Great, but his rule is weak, and the Gothic elite are divided. Famine and poor harvests only intensify this unrest. Cassiodorus, who once penned idealistic visions of Gothic Roman cooperation, now writes somberly of the sun dimmed as if in an eclipse, lasting for almost a year, never rising at full strength. Even the bureaucrats know something is terribly wrong. Further east, the great city of Constantinople, home to the mighty Emperor Justinian I, becomes an anxious beacon of the Byzantine world. The court is busy with war, politics, and lawmaking. But Justinian's scholars, monks, and officials begin to suspect that this strange weather is not merely a seasonal quirk. Procopius, who writes detailed accounts of the emperor's reign, notes that the sun was dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. People take this to mean that God is angry. In such times, faith becomes both a comfort and a weapon. Churches fill across Europe and the Near East with frightened men and women praying for deliverance. Some blame pagans, others suspect Jews, and still others begin to look within their own communities for scapegoats. The social order, already fragile, begins to bend under the pressure. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire is locked in the Gothic War, trying to reclaim lost western territories from the Ostrogoths. The campaign, already expensive and brutal, becomes even more difficult in the face of supply shortages, frozen rivers, and unpredictable weather. Troops suffer not just from enemy swords, but from hunger and cold. Elsewhere, monks and missionaries record these strange happenings in Latin, Greek, Coptic, and Syriac. They note the dim sun, the cold summers, the poor harvests. In one Syriac chronicle, a scribe writes, "In the year 848 536 AD, there was a great and terrible sign. The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day, it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow." These words, preserved for centuries in dusty archives, echo the same helplessness you feel now, the same strangeness, the same fear. You and your family begin to rely on foraged food, roots, bitter greens, bark from trees. You learn which herbs will not kill you. You hear rumors of places that still have grain, and of others where people have begun eating the flesh of the dead. You do not know what to believe. In many regions, banditry increases. Roads that once connected towns and markets are now dangerous. Traveling merchants disappear. Caravans are looted not for gold, but for food. Castles once used for defense now serve as storehouses and prisons. In cities like Rome, the food situation grows more dire. Aqueducts and granaries have been poorly maintained since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and as the famine deepens, riots occasionally break out over bread. In some regions, entire city quarters are empty as people flee to the countryside in search of food, only to find that the countryside is in worse shape. And then, in 537, something even more ominous occurred. In the port cities of the eastern Mediterranean, rats begin to gather in greater numbers. Fleas, carried on their backs, bear an ancient enemy, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. No one knows it yet, but the stage is being set for the next great disaster, the plague of Justinian. It will begin in a few years, in 541 AD, and it will kill millions. But the groundwork has already been laid for a population weakened by famine, migration, and climate disaster. This is how history often works. One crisis does not stand alone, it invites others. Like a cracked roof under heavy snow, one disaster begins to stress the beams until the entire structure collapses. Back in your village, you find that the elders are speaking less. Some have died quietly in their sleep, others have taken too long fasts, believing that their death might preserve food for younger generations. There is no ceremony for them, just a shallow grave, covered quickly, sometimes unmarked. Trade collapses. In most of Europe, coins become less important than barter. Iron tools, salt, dried meat, are now the currency of survival. You no longer think about festivals, marriages, or saints' days. You think only about the next meal. In Ireland, famine leads to population decline. Entire clans vanish from the records. The annals of Tigernach and Ulster mention repeated crop failures between 536 and 539. In what is now Scotland, Pictish communities seem to retreat from the lowlands into more remote, defensible places. In Scandinavia, the impact is even more visible. Archaeological evidence from this period shows widespread settlement abandonment. Tree ring data from Sweden and Finland shows a sharp drop in growth, indicating prolonged cold. Some Norse myths, centuries later, may even reflect memories of this dark period, tales of Fimbulvita, the mighty winter that precedes the end of the world. It is important to remember that these changes do not come all at once. They are gradual, insidious, and easy to dismiss until they are too large to ignore. This is the nature of catastrophe when it moves slowly, and now, you wonder, will the sun ever return? The elders once told stories of warm days and long evenings, when the sun would hang low in the sky until late at night. Children played, markets bustled, and life was ordinary. But you cannot remember the last time you felt warmth on your skin. Across the world, a slow shift is happening not just in weather, but in human memory. People begin to adapt to the darkness. They build smaller fires, plant harder grains, and move closer together. The disaster is not yet over, and something worse is brewing, but humanity does not surrender easily. Even in this, the so-called worst year to be alive, people endure. They hold on to life by brittle threads, but those threads may not hold forever. So the question lingers. What happens when the light doesn't return and something far deadlier begins to spread? After the darkness collapse, plague, and the long recovery, the year is 540 AD. You have lived through the dimming of the sun, the failures of the harvests, and the slow unraveling of your village's way of life. In those long grey days of 536 and 537, you feared the world had ended, or at least changed in some permanent, unknowable way. In some ways it had. Now, as you walk past the skeletal remains of once thriving fields, you notice signs of strange change. The sunlight, though still pale, is finally beginning to return. The shadows are a bit sharper. The birds, fewer in number than before, are chirping again. Grass grows where there has been mud and frost. But even as the earth begins to warm, something colder, something invisible is moving swiftly through the world. You see the first signs not in the sky or soil, but in the bodies. A man comes to your village, gaunt, exhausted, feverish. He collapses in the village square and dies the next day, his neck and armpits swollen with black lumps. Within days, 3 others follow. One woman bleeds from her nose and mouth before falling silent. The healer shakes her head, helpless. This is not the famine. It is not hunger nor cold. This is something new, something with no name yet, but one that will be remembered for centuries. The year 541 marks the beginning of what will become one of the first truly global pandemics in recorded history. The plague of Justinian. Historians and scientists now agree that this was likely the first appearance of the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same one that would later devastate Europe. Again in the 14th century, as the Black Death. It begins in the Egyptian port of Pelusium. Ships laden with grain and stowaway rats travel north toward Constantinople. By 542, the plague reached the Byzantine capital. Procopius, the court historian, writes in grim detail, "There was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. They died as though seized by a violent and sudden stroke of fate." In Constantinople, the death toll may have reached 5,000 to 10,000 people per day at the peak. Justinian himself contracts the illness, though he survives. His empire, however, suffers deeply. Trade halts, fields go untended, government services collapse, bodies are piled in buildings, on boats, even thrown into the sea. The historian John of Ephesus recalls seeing carts filled with corpses moving through the streets. Graves overflowed. People dug mass pits in orchards and gardens. Priests stopped ringing funeral bells. There were simply too many dead. Outside the city, the countryside fared little better. The plague spreads along trade routes, through soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims, across Anatolia, North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually into Europe. The disease spreads like wildfire. In Gaul, bishops begin to record what they call the Great Mortality. In the Eastern Roman provinces, whole towns disappear from tax records, no one left to pay. One estimate by modern scholars suggests that up to 50% of the population in some areas may have died over the course of the first wave. And yet the plague does not come just once. It returns in cycles, waves of death that crash upon the weakened shores of every surviving city and village for nearly 2 centuries. You, in your village far from the great cities, may not understand what's happening, but you see the effects. Fewer traders, fewer travelers, and an eerie quiet where once the roads were busy. You hear stories from passing monks of whole monasteries wiped out, of cities silenced. By the mid-540s, Europe and much of the Mediterranean world was changed. The climatic chaos of 536 to 540, likely triggered by multiple volcanic eruptions, has led to food shortages, famine, and the breakdown of trade. On top of this, the plague now stalks the recovering population. Together they create a perfect storm of depopulation, social fragmentation, and economic regression. In Britain, this period aligns with the final crumbling of Roman-influenced rule. The Brittonic kingdoms, already weakened, become increasingly isolated. Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes continue to move inland. The social memory of Roman order fades even faster now, replaced by fragmented warlord rule and mythologized stories of a golden past. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence shows a sudden and sharp decline in settlement activity. The elite burial traditions, rich graves filled with imported goods, vanished during this time. A few scholars even argue that the Norse myths of Ragnarok, the Great Winter, and the death of the gods may have been born from oral memories of this strange, dark period. In Italy, the Byzantine reconquest stalls. The Gothic War drags on for nearly 2 decades, devastating the peninsula. Cities like Rome and Ravenna change hands multiple times, and both sides suffer immensely from famine and plague. The once cities of Roman heritage are hollowed out, their populations decimated, their infrastructure failing. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire, tax records show entire villages simply vanish. The imperial government, already stretched thin from war and disaster, begins to lose control over distant territories. Tribal groups on the fringes take advantage of the chaos, raiding settlements and carving out their own domains. Even in the Sassanid Empire, to the east, Byzantium's greatest rival, the plague spreads. Though records are fewer, there is enough evidence to suggest the entire Near East was affected. Some regions would take generations to recover, and yet, not everything ends. You and many others survive. You do not do it with swords or speeches, but with the quiet stubbornness of ordinary people. You plant turnips instead of wheat. You learn how to catch wild game, how to dry herbs, how to mend clothing 100 times. You listen to the seasons more closely now. You no longer assume the sun will rise in strength, so you treasure every warm day, every dry harvest out in the churches. Priests begin to speak not of punishment, but of endurance. New saints are venerated. Martyrs who died during the plague, monks who fed the hungry, women who healed the sick. In some towns, the disaster brings people closer. In others, it breaks them apart. In Constantinople, once the center of the civilized world, Justinian's grand dreams of reconquest are tempered by reality. The Gothic Wars nearly destroyed Italy. His armies are exhausted, his people traumatized, but the empire does not fall. Instead, New strategies arise. Land once held by the dead is redistributed. Surviving laborers can demand higher wages. In some places, small landowners rise in wealth. Survivors marry more quickly, have more children. The seeds of recovery are sown in the ashes of collapse. Even the skies, eventually, begin to return to normal. By the late 540s, ice core records show that volcanic aerosols have dissipated. Tree ring data from Europe indicates a return to warmer, wetter summers. Fields begin to produce again. Famine loosens its grip. The trauma of the 530s and 540s does not vanish, but it becomes memory today. We know more about this mysterious period than ever before. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica allow modern scientists to identify the years 536 and 540 as moments of intense volcanic activity. Microscopic ash particles, tephra, are matched to eruptions in Iceland and El Salvador. Some speculate that these eruptions, combined with others, created a global volcanic winter, plunging temperatures by up to 5 degrees Celsius, 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. These climate shifts, compounded by plague, mark the start of what scholars now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of cooler, more volatile weather that lasted until about 660 AD. Some historians believe that this combination of disaster accelerated the fall of empires and the reordering of the world. It weakened Rome's successors, strained Persia, and changed the balance of power across Eurasia. It opened doors for the rise of Islam in the 7th century, reshaped northern European cultures, and transformed trade and agriculture. But perhaps most remarkable of all is that the world recovered. You are no longer in 536, you are at 550 now. The sun shines again, though not as warmly as before. The children played again, though many were lost. The land yields again, though not without effort. Life goes on quietly, humbly, persistently. What else lies in history's forgotten shadows, waiting to be rediscovered in the ashes of the ordinary? Story 2. The Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. The problem that nearly choked the world streets of stench. You walk the cobbled streets of London in the early spring of 1894. The air is damp with fog, but beneath it lies a heavier scent, one you've grown used to but never quite accept. A blend of ammonia, decaying straw, and something unmistakably organic. You sidestep as best you can, hopping over a puddle with a slick brown sheen. It's not water. It hasn't rained in days. You're not alone. The city around you pulses with life. Carts rattling along the avenues, newspaper boys shouting headlines, women in long skirts lifting their hems above the filth, and carriages navigating carefully through ruts and refuse. But absolutely everywhere there is manure, horse manure. London in 1894 was powered by horses, not electricity, not petroleum, but hooves and hay. They move people, deliver mail, haul food, and cart away garbage. It's a city of nearly 5 million people, and it runs on the backs of over 50,000 horses. Each horse produces between 15 to 35 pounds, 7 to 16 kilograms of manure per day, plus a few quarts of urine. Do the math, and you get a city producing hundreds of tons of manure daily, most of which ends up right there on the street. And this isn't just a London problem. New York, Paris, Berlin, Boston, Chicago all are drowning in manure. In New York alone, over 100,000 horses work the streets, producing an estimated 2.5 million pounds, 1,100 metric tons of manure every day. At the time, it was viewed as a crisis with no end in sight. Horses were indispensable. For short trips, you had the hansom cab or the four-wheeled hackney. Delivery wagons clattered through alleys, loaded with milk, coal, vegetables, and everything in between. Fire engines, ambulances, omnibuses, all relied on horses. Yet with every trot, the city grew dirtier. In the poorer quarters, manure piled in alleys and open lots, fermenting in the heat, attracting flies by the millions. In the more affluent neighborhoods, teams of street cleaners tried to keep up, shoveling manure into carts and hauling it to manure wharves by the Thames, literal docks piled high with steaming horse dung, waiting to be removed by barge. But there was too much. It overwhelmed the system. The Times of London, in a grim 1894 editorial, declared, "In 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure." It wasn't hyperbole. Urban planners were genuinely terrified. They had seen the curves of population growth and horse use rising in parallel. There seemed to be no solution. London held its first international urban planning conference in 1898, and the horse manure problem was topic number 1. Delegates from major cities came together not to discuss architecture, sanitation, reform, or transportation innovation, but to figure out what to do about the excrement problem. They didn't figure it out. The conference ended early, in failure that manure wasn't just a nuisance, it was a threat. In a time before antibiotics, bacteria thrived in the waste-choked streets. Manure dried and turned to dust, which was then kicked up by hooves, wheels, and shoes. It floated through the air, infiltrating homes, lungs, and water sources. Infant mortality in cities was high. Respiratory illnesses were rampant. Typhoid and cholera stalked the slums. The flies were worse. They bred in the manure and carried disease everywhere. One estimate suggested that New York's manure produced billions of flies each summer. Even the dead horses were a problem. A healthy draft horse weighed about 1,300 pounds. When it collapsed in the street, which it often did from overwork or illness, it couldn't simply be lifted away. Street workers waited for the carcass to begin decomposing so it was soft enough to chop up and haul off in pieces. Some cities tried covering roads with sawdust or sand, but this merely disguised the problem and created a new slush. In winter, manure froze into uneven, slick piles. In spring, it thawed into puddles of rot. The manure problem was so bad, so ever-present, that it became invisible. People stopped remarking on it. Instead, they accepted it as the price of modern life. And yet, beneath this acceptance was deep concern. Everyone agreed. This couldn't go on. Why not simply remove the manure faster, or reduce the number of horses? The answer, as always, was money. Horses were expensive. A good draft horse could cost the equivalent of several months' wages, but the infrastructure supporting them was immense. Stables, farriers, veterinarians, carriage makers, teamster unions, and an entire economy revolved around the horse. Manure, ironically, had once been an asset. In the early 1800s, farmers paid for urban horse manure to fertilize their fields. But by the late 19th century, the supply had far outstripped demand. Rural areas began refusing shipments. Cities had to pay to get rid of it. The burden fell mostly on municipalities and private carriage companies. Manure removal was labor-intensive, slow, and expensive. Even with fleets of sweepers, carts, and barges, it was impossible to keep up. Horses were also space inefficient. A horse needed rest, food, water, and stabling. One estimate suggested that over 25% of urban land was devoted to horses, not streets or buildings, but stables, feed stores, and manure depots. The system was collapsing under its own weight. Yet, in 1894, there was no clear alternative. The horse was still seen as irreplaceable, a crisis without a solution. At the time, new technologies were emerging: steam-powered trams, cable cars, even some crude internal combustion engines. But these were small-scale, expensive, and unreliable. Electricity was limited to central urban areas and was not yet trusted for transport. And automobiles, laughable, clumsy, slow, dangerous, they were curiosities for inventors and aristocrats, not serious tools of commerce. So city planners despaired in private meetings. Some discussed building new underground manure tunnels. Others suggested expanding manure islands in rivers to store waste until farmers could be convinced to buy it. Still others proposed vertical stabling systems, essentially manure silos to hold the waste out of sight. These were not jokes, they were real proposals from respected engineers. The public had ideas too. Some argued for mandatory horse diapers. Others advocated banning horses from certain neighborhoods. Still others simply moved to the countryside, but none of it worked. The streets continued to fill, the cities kept growing, the horses kept coming. And so, as 1894 drew to a close, London and its sister cities seemed locked in a stinking stalemate. The horse, symbol of power, progress, and prestige, had become the very thing choking the modern metropolis. No one knew what would come next, only that something had to. The unexpected savior. By the end of 1894, it felt as if the industrialized world was facing a future buried in its own success. Cities had grown large, fast, and hungry for movement, but their streets, pulsing with life and labor, were also festering with waste. You can picture it clearly: an overworked draft horse pulling a heavy cart of coal through the narrow streets of New York. Its hooves clop over layers of manure already mashed into the cobblestones. The driver shouts at pedestrians who cross too close. Behind the cart, another waits, stuck in traffic, the driver wiping flies from his brow. The air smells of rot and hay. And yet, around the corner, inside a small shed that smells of hot oil and machine grease, something is stirring, something that most of the world ignores, laughs at, or finds irritatingly noisy. It's a machine with no reins, no feedback, and no need for rest. A carriage without a horse. In cities drowning in manure, the solution was already rolling quietly into view and almost no one noticed. The automobile, still an infant technology in the early 1890s, was regarded by most as a novelty for the rich, or the eccentric. The vehicles were noisy, unreliable, and expensive. They often broke down, sputtered, or frightened pedestrians and horses alike. Steam-powered vehicles had been around since the early 19th century, but they were bulky and required skilled operators. Gasoline-powered internal combustion engines were newer and controversial. Early cars looked like carts with boilers or bicycle wheels. They shook violently on cobbled streets and gave off a pungent smell of oil and smoke. Still, a few pioneers saw potential. In Germany, Carl Benz had created a three-wheeled gasoline car in 1885. In the United States, Charles and Frank Duryea began testing a motor wagon of their own in 1893, and by 1895 they were organizing the first American car race from Chicago to Evanston and back, a grueling journey of just over 50 miles that took over 10 hours. Most laughed. Few imagined the car would be more than a toy. But in the manure-choked cities of the industrial world, the car quietly solved several critical problems. No manure, no excrement, no urine, no flies. It was, by default, cleaner, smaller footprint. Cars didn't need to be stabled or fed. They didn't take up pasture land. They sat dormant when not in use. Consistent speed and endurance. While early cars had breakdowns, they didn't tire like horses. No rest, no oats, no water needed. Fuel. Storage and distribution. It was easier to store gasoline than hay or manure. And eventually, as fueling stations appeared, cars would become even more convenient. Electric vehicles. Surprisingly, many early adopters didn't go for gasoline at all. They went electric. In the 1890s, electric cars were actually more popular than gas-powered ones, especially in cities like New York and London. They were quieter, cleaner, and required less effort to operate. Women, in particular, found them more suitable than hand-cranked gasoline cars. In fact, by 1900, over one-third of all vehicles in the US were electric. Another third was steam-powered. Gasoline cars lagged behind. This makes sense. Electricity was already powering homes and businesses in dense urban areas. Why not cars? The limitations, of course, were range and charging infrastructure problems that would become more evident later. But the important shift had begun. People were beginning to think beyond the horse. As the 1890s gave way to the new century, the cost of owning and maintaining a horse began to seem increasingly inefficient, even foolish. Let's compare. Feeding a horse cost about $180 a year, a significant expense in the 1890s. A horse could work only a limited number of hours a day before tiring. Horses needed stables, grooms, blacksmiths, veterinarians. The average working life of a horse was about 3 to 4 years in the city. Meanwhile, new automobiles, while expensive, at first, offered longer lifespans, greater speed, and reduced ongoing costs. As manufacturing improved, their prices began to drop. In 1901, Ransom Olds introduced the Oldsmobile Curved Dash, the first mass-produced gasoline automobile. It was cheaper, simpler, and more durable than previous models. It was, in many ways, the Model T before the Model T still. This was not yet a revolution, just a ripple. The real breakthrough would come in 1908, when a Detroit engineer and entrepreneur named Henry Ford introduced the Model T. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he reinvented how it was built, and who it was built for. His goal was not to make luxury machines for the rich. It was to make practical tools for the working class, to build them faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than anyone else. In 1913, he introduced the moving assembly line, cutting the time to build a car from 12 hours to about 90 minutes. Prices dropped dramatically. In 1908, the Model T costs about $850. By the 1920s, it sold for under $300. By 1914, Ford's plant in Highland Park was producing nearly 250,000 vehicles a year. By the mid-1920s, that number would soar above 2 million. The car, once a curiosity, had become the most important urban technology in the world, and perhaps most importantly, the horse was finally being replaced. It didn't happen all at once. In 1900, there were still more than 120,000 horses in New York City alone. Streets still had manure. Flies still buzzed. But by the 1920s, the change was visible. Even dramatic.streettars replaced horse-drawn trolleys. Trucks took over deliveries. Motorized cabs and buses filled the roads. Horses, once the symbol of wealth and industry, were now seen as old-fashioned. Cities that once despaired over manure now found themselves with a new set of challenges: oil spills, traffic congestion, and pedestrian fatalities. But at least the 9-foot manure prophecy of the times never came to pass. The streets were cleaner, the air marginally fresher, public health improved, and urban planning, once locked in a manure-based dead end, could move forward. Today, the great horse manure crisis of 1894 is largely forgotten as a footnote in urban history. Few remember how close cities came to choking on their own waste. Fewer still realize that the automobile, often now blamed for pollution and urban sprawl, was once seen as a green alternative. It's a striking reminder of how solutions can come from unexpected places. The problem that seemed unsolvable, one that led international planners to despair and surrender, was quietly resolved not by shovels, tunnels, or manure islands, but by innovation, persistence, and a willingness to rethink the obvious. The cities didn't dig their way out. They drove out. And yet one question still lingers in solving the problems of the 19th century. What new ones did we create for the 21st? The new dawn from cold shadows. The fires had gone out. The skies, once choked with ash and dread, began gradually, cautiously, to reveal the sun again. In the years following the mysterious catastrophe of 536 CE, and the second blow of 540, a slow and painful healing process began across Eurasia. But this was no triumphant restoration. Rather, it was the weary, plodding survival of empires, communities, and individuals who had endured famine, war, and spiritual darkness. Let us return to Constantinople, where the Emperor Justinian still reigned. By the mid-540s, the Byzantine Empire was clinging to life amid the wreckage. The plague of Justinian had ravaged the population, wiping out perhaps a third to half of Constantinople's residents. The imperial court tried to function, but the streets were quiet. Trade had slowed to a trickle, the Nile had not flooded predictably, and Italy remained a battlefield. Justinian, aging and increasingly isolated, clung to his vision of renovatio imperii, the restoration of the Roman Empire's former glory. But even he could not have foreseen how long the world would take to recover. In fact, the empire would survive, but it would never again be what it had been. And yet, in the very depths of despair, human adaptation was quietly unfolding in Ireland. Monks at remote monasteries began keeping records again. Their scribes, often huddled in stone rooms, warmed only by the breath of candlelight, noted that the sun finally returned to its normal brightness in the 550s. Grass began to grow more reliably. Livestock were born and raised in higher numbers. The long winter had not broken the Irish, though it had tested their endurance beyond anything in living memory. In China, under the rule of the Northern Wei and later Northern Zhou dynasties, the political turmoil had not ceased, but food became slightly more available as agricultural output improved. Buddhist monks resumed their work translating Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese. Temples, though still operating at reduced capacity, became focal points for communities traumatized by death and change. The spiritual hunger, it seemed, was as urgent as the physical. Even the Sassanid Empire of Persia, longtime rivals to the Byzantines, slowly emerged from their crisis. Under Khosrow I, reforms were enacted to strengthen the army, improve taxation, and rebuild agricultural lands that had suffered under repeated locust infestations and droughts. Persia, unlike Rome, had not collapsed under the weight of environmental change, though it had staggered. What is most revealing about this period is not merely what was lost, but what began to grow in the ashes. The Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe began to migrate more actively, taking advantage of weakened borders and abandoned lands. Their presence would shape the future of Eastern Europe for centuries. Similarly, the Avars, a nomadic group from Central Asia, began pushing westward, gradually pressuring the remnants of Roman and Germanic powers in the Balkans. In the British Isles, the kingdoms that would one day become England were still emerging. The Roman legions had long since departed, but Anglo-Saxon settlers were establishing dominions in Kent, Wessex, and Northumbria. These kingdoms had suffered from the cooling as well. Archaeological evidence shows crop disruption and changes in burial patterns, but they endured, often through closer local cooperation and changes in land use. But perhaps the most subtle and ironic consequence of the Dark Age, that followed 536 CE, was the beginning of what some historians now call the Late Antique. Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooler global temperatures that persisted for more than a century. This colder era reshaped ecosystems. It affected which crops could grow, which animals could survive, and which diseases could spread. It changed the migratory patterns of both humans and animals, and it made clear, if ever it needed proving, that human civilization, for all its stone walls and mighty cities, was still at the mercy of the natural world. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the clouds of dust and soot had finally dispersed, but something else had shifted, less visible, yet equally lasting. People remembered. The trauma had been preserved in oral tradition, in fragmented texts, and in haunting silences across the archaeological record. A field left fallow for 30 years, a village burned and never rebuilt, a child's grave in Scandinavia, buried with pine cones and no offerings, suggesting hunger, not ceremony. The slow recovery was marked not by triumph but by reconfiguration. In Byzantium, the loss of urban populations helped decentralize power. Rural estates grew in importance. In China, scholars debated not only political philosophy but also weather omens and the strange rhythms of the heavens. Religion surged and people turned to gods, spirits, and saints in search of explanation. And perhaps it was in this period of mystery and absence that a new idea began to form across multiple cultures, that not everything could be known, controlled, or even named. That history, like nature, sometimes moved silently and indifferently through human lives. We now know, thanks to the work of climatologists, dendrochronologists, and glaciologists, that the events of 536 were not a singular catastrophe but part of a sequence of at least 4 massive volcanic eruptions in 536, 540, 547, and again in the early 600s. Each one injected sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, cooling the earth and disrupting rainfall. But at the time, no one knew what a volcano even was. To the people of Constantinople, Antioch, Chang'an, or Ireland, it must have felt like the world itself was collapsing. And in a sense it was. The interconnected networks of food, trade, and culture that had sustained empires were suddenly fragile. The earth had changed, and the consequences were global. Yet, as it always does, humanity adapted, slowly, unevenly, in some places better than others. And as the 7th century began, a new storm was quietly brewing in the Arabian Peninsula. A new religious movement, begun in the desert by a merchant named Muhammad, would soon reshape the world more completely than even the ash clouds of 536. The Islamic conquests would begin shortly after his death in 632 CE, forever transforming the political and religious map of Eurasia and North Africa. So, did the darkness of 536 and the years following prepare the world for this shift? Did the long suffering of those years loosen the old empires, disrupt the stagnant, and create space for the new? Perhaps. History, after all, is not always changed by one sword, one king, or one law. Sometimes, it is changed by a sky that does not brighten, a harvest that does not come, or a silence that lasts too long. And now, centuries later, we still look back at the year 536, the year the sun dimmed and the world chilled, and we ask, if something like that happened again, would we recognize it in time, or would we only realize it when the silence returned? The Great Stink of London, 1858, a city that smelled itself awake. You find yourself in the sweltering summer of 1858. London, the heart of the British Empire, epicenter of industry, empire, and enlightenment, reeks, not metaphorically, quite literally. It smells like death. As you drift past the River Thames, the lifeblood of the city, your senses recoil. The water, thick and brown, sluggishly moves past embankments lined with markets, piers, and grand parliamentary buildings. On its surface floats refuse, animal carcasses, and something much worse than human waste. You breathe through your sleeve, but it barely helps. Everyone else is doing the same. London is choking on its own filth. This was no sudden catastrophe. The Great Stink was a slow-boiling problem, generations in the making, the result of misguided infrastructure, population boom, and, quite tragically, ignorance wrapped in the pride of industrial progress. The city had grown too rapidly. From a population of just under 1 million in 1800, it swelled to more than 3 million by mid-century. Homes were packed tighter, streets busier, but the city's waste systems remained largely medieval in design. You may picture sewers as underground rivers whisking away waste from homes, but London in 1858 didn't have a comprehensive sewer system. Most houses had cesspits or simply discharged their waste into open drains, which then flowed directly into the Thames. These same drains were often shared with rainwater, kitchen waste, and sometimes even slaughterhouse runoff. On rainy days, the overflow surged back into basements. On dry days, the waste festered in the sun. But this summer was especially hot, unbearably so. With each day of heat, the stench of decomposition intensified. The Thames, once painted in romantic watercolor by painters, had become a toxic ribbon slicing through the city. And, more terrifying still, it wasn't just offensive. To the nose it was deadly. This was the same Thames that provided the city's drinking water, and the city had already endured several cholera epidemics. The people of London, however, still clung to the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were spread by bad smells, not by waterborne bacteria. They thought the stench itself made you ill. That belief shaped everything about their response. In earlier outbreaks, authorities focused on removing foul-smelling sources like rotting meat or waste piles. They didn't target the water. Even now, as the Thames boiled with human effluent under the summer sun, little was done to prevent people from drawing their drinking water from it. Across the river, the newly built Houses of Parliament were just finishing construction, a magnificent building, adorned with towers and gold-leaf trim. It stood proudly yet helplessly beside the reeking river. Politicians couldn't avoid the smell. It seeped through the drapes and curtains, through the walls and windows. Reports say that the curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in an attempt to mask the odor. Even Queen Victoria remarked on the most dreadful effluvia when she traveled along the river. For decades, the issue of sanitation had been raised by reformers like Edwin Chadwick and the physician, John Snow. Snow's maps during the 1854 cholera outbreak had shown that the disease clustered around specific water pumps, not the worst-smelling neighborhoods, but his findings were met with resistance. Snow's premature death in 1858 meant he never saw his theory vindicated. At the time of the Great Stink, the prevailing wisdom still clung to the idea that purifying the air was the answer. The British press chronicled the misery. The Times wrote, "We can colonize India, we can hold China in the hollow of our hand, we can pay the interest on the national debt and look brave to all the world, but we cannot clean the River Thames." People began carrying handkerchiefs soaked in lavender oil or vinegar to their faces, but it didn't help. Nothing did. And then something extraordinary happened. Something rare in government action. The smell had become so unbearable, even the privileged could no longer ignore it. Parliament suspended sessions because members were becoming physically ill. Politicians, once content to debate policy in abstraction, were now forced to reckon with their own olfactory misery. Responsibility eventually fell into the hands of a quiet civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He had already been working on plans for a unified sewage system for London, but budget concerns and inertia had kept them from implementation. But now, in the height of the Great Stink, Bazalgette's plan was approved with funding and urgency. Bazalgette wasn't a charismatic revolutionary. He wasn't out to make headlines or challenge authority. He was an engineer in the purest sense, meticulous, practical, and obsessed with numbers and flow rates. His approach would transform not just London, but the way modern cities understood public health. But before he could build, he had to face a daunting challenge: redesigning a city's bowels while it was still functioning and rotting from the inside. As Section 1 closes, consider this: how do you rebuild a system so essential to life when every pipe, every street, every home is already connected to something broken? Joseph Bazalgette and the battle beneath London. Joseph Bazalgette had a problem with the size of a city. When Parliament finally gave its reluctant blessing to his project, London's fate began to shift. But no one could truly grasp the scale of what he was about to attempt. This wasn't merely about laying a few pipes or cleaning up a few cesspools. Bazalgette had to reroute centuries of filth, millions of gallons of human waste, household runoff, industrial sludge, and build a system that not only fixed London's present crisis, but anticipated its explosive future. First, he measured. Bazalgette was a man obsessed with precision. He calculated the size of every pipe, not just for the current population but for what the city might become. He estimated the needs of 4 million people, even though London only held about 3 million at the time. Most thought this was excessive. Some called it arrogant, but he would later be proven almost prophetic. He envisioned a network of main interceptor sewers, massive underground arteries that would run parallel to the river, intercepting smaller neighborhood sewers before they could reach the Thames. These giant conduits would then carry the waste far downriver beyond the urban core, where it could be safely discharged with minimal impact. To accomplish this, Bazalgette would need to dig through a city that was already built. Streets were already crowded, homes already tightly packed, commerce already humming above the very ground he needed to tear apart. And then there was the smell. Construction began in earnest in 1859. Thousands of workers, nicknamed navvies, short for navigators, descended upon the capital. Many had worked on railroads or canals. Some had survived cholera outbreaks in their own towns. Their work was dangerous, dark, and relentless. They dug day and night through London clay, brick by brick, often in knee-deep sewage. The tunnels they created were vast and rounded, shaped like enormous keyholes or eggs laid on their side, an engineering trick to maximize flow and reduce blockages. The greatest of these was the northern outfall, sewer, an underground river of filth that stretched over 11 miles. It began near the center of the city and curved eastward, eventually emptying into the Thames at Barking Creek, far from central London. Above ground, massive embankments were built to contain the new sewers while also reshaping the city's face. Bazalgette didn't just hide the pipes, he used them as the foundation for urban transformation. His Victoria Embankment, for instance, did triple duty. It housed sewers, created a new roadway, and added a riverside pedestrian space lined with trees. Londoners got modern sanitation in a beautified city. But the project was not without conflict. Property owners complained about vibration from tunneling. Businesses feared disruption. Some members of parliament grumbled about the cost, which ballooned to over £3 million, an astronomical sum at the time. Yet Bazalgette pressed on. He answered every complaint with data, every insult with a drawing. He was no charismatic leader, but he was relentless. He understood something few others did, that civilization lives and dies by its invisible infrastructure. Meanwhile, science was beginning to catch up with Bazalgette's instincts. Although still controversial, John Snow's waterborne theory of cholera was gaining traction. The evidence was mounting, most notably from the very systems Bazalgette was replacing. Neighborhoods with cleaner water supplies reported fewer illnesses. With each improvement in waste disposal, health statistics improved. Still, there were skeptics. Some doctors clung to miasma theory like a badge of tradition. Others saw the river's pollution as an aesthetic issue, not a medical one. Then came 1866. London, by this point, was halfway through the construction of Bazalgette's system. Not all districts were yet connected. That year, another cholera outbreak swept the city, but something had changed. The pattern of death no longer spread uniformly. Instead, cholera struck only the areas still using old sewers and contaminated pumps. The new neighborhoods connected to Bazalgette's interceptors. They remained mostly untouched. The proof was undeniable. For the first time, a majority of health officials accepted that cholera was waterborne, not airborne. John Snow, who had died 8 years earlier, was posthumously vindicated. Bazalgette's work wasn't just making London smell better, it was saving thousands of them. His system was completed in 1875. It included over 1,100 miles of street sewers feeding into 82 miles of intercepting sewers. It had 4 pumping stations and countless manholes, culverts, and ventilation shafts. In its entirety, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a subterranean network as complex and vital as the veins and arteries of the human body. But most Londoners never saw it. That was Bazalgette's gift. He made the filth disappear. The city, for the first time in its history, no longer had to live atop its own waste. Streets became cleaner. The river began to flow again. The stink faded, and yet Bazalgette's true brilliance lay not in what he built, but in how he anticipated the future. He had made the pipes bigger than needed. He had reinforced the tunnels with extra brick. He had, in every choice, added room for growth. More than 150 years later, London still uses much of his system. Only recently has the city begun constructing new super sewers to supplement the originals. Bazalgette's vision not only fixed the crisis of his time, it laid the groundwork for a new kind of city, one where public health was part of the urban fabric, not an afterthought. So what was the legacy of the Great Stink? At first glance, it was the construction of a sewer system, but at a deeper level, it was a change in mindset. The crisis had forced the city and its leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth, that even the most powerful empire in the world could be brought low by its own negligence in the end. It wasn't just the smell that woke them up. It was the realization that progress without planning, industry without infrastructure, growth without responsibility was a recipe for collapse. Joseph Bazalgette didn't wear a crown or command an army, but in the story of London, he stands as one of its greatest heroes. Salt and sovereignty. You might think salt, in all its humble crystalline form, couldn't possibly shape kingdoms or stir rebellion. But as the Salt Road neared its twilight years in the late 1600s and early 1700s, it had already done both. This stretch of mineral trade, once lifeblood for empires and vital to the survival of commoners, was now becoming a liability. And still, the story wasn't quite over. That's the economic and political tides shifted in early modern Europe, particularly in places like France, Italy, and India. Salt remained stubbornly significant. Monarchs and colonial authorities, ever in need of revenue, clung to salt taxes with a vice grip. It was easy to control, vital to life, and universally consumed. And so, it was taxed heavily. In France, the gabelle, the infamous salt tax, became one of the most hated levies imposed by the crown. At its height, under the Ancien regime, the gabelle wasn't just a source of income. It was a system of control. The country was divided into several regions, each with different rules. Some could buy and sell salt freely. Others were forced to buy fixed quantities from government depots at exorbitant prices. Smuggling faux souvenirs became a way of life. Entire communities along the Loire and Brittany coasts engaged in illicit salt trades, defying royal officers, dodging taxmen, and developing their own local economies. You might wonder, why not just accept the price? After all, salt was essential, but not exactly glamorous. Yet, imagine being a peasant required by law to purchase a quota of salt that you couldn't afford, and you weren't even allowed to share or trade it. In some areas, families had to buy over 7 kilograms of salt per person per year. If you had 5 children, that was nearly 50 kilos, far more than you'd reasonably need. Punishments were harsh. Smugglers were imprisoned, branded, and sometimes even sent to the galleys. Thousands of people were punished each year simply for trying to season their food or preserve fish and meat without going bankrupt. By the 1700s, the salt tax had come to symbolize royal excess and cruelty, and when revolution came, it was not forgotten. During the French Revolution of 1789, one of the first demands of the rebellious citizenry was the abolition of the gabelle. The tax was repealed, then reinstated, then repealed again, each time reflecting the changing political winds of France. The salt tax, which had seemed so immovable for centuries, was eventually buried in the rubble of monarchy, but not before, shaping lives, fueling resistance, and becoming one of the quiet, grainy villains of history. Elsewhere, salt followed a similarly contested path. In India, salt remained a cornerstone of both economy and oppression. The Mughal Empire had taxed salt, but it was under British colonial rule that salt became a symbol of imperial exploitation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the East India Company and later the British Raj established a near monopoly on salt production and distribution. The British imposed a tax so high it doubled the price of salt for Indian consumers, especially cruel in a tropical country where salt was necessary to survive the heat. By the late 1800s, massive salt works had been established along the coastal marshes, most notably at places like Sambar Lake and the Rann of Kutch. Indian workers, often from the lowest castes, toiled in brutal conditions to harvest salt that they could barely afford themselves. The salt laws prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt on their own. Even drying seawater without a license was a crime. Salt smuggling again became a quiet form of resistance, one punished with fines, imprisonment, and violence. You may have heard about one of the most famous moments in Indian history, the Salt March in 1930. Mahatma Gandhi led a 240-mile walk from his ashram to the Arabian Sea, where he symbolically picked up a lump of salt, defying British law. This peaceful act ignited widespread protests across India and highlighted how a seemingly ordinary substance like salt could become the foundation of civil disobedience. It was not just about the grain of salt but what it represented: economic exploitation, cultural erosion, and foreign domination. But let's return to the quieter days of the Salt Road before it became a symbol of rebellion. In parts of Africa, especially along the ancient trans-Saharan routes, salt remained a precious commodity well into the 19th century. Caravans of camels would carry blocks of salt from the mines of Tagaza and Taudini to the markets of Timbuktu. These blocks were so valuable they were traded pound for pound with gold. Yet the salt trade was grueling. The mines were hellish. Men worked barefoot in pits where the sun reflected off white salt walls, baking them from every angle. The journey to deliver these blocks across the desert could take weeks. Camels were laden with heavy slabs and forced through sandstorms, heat waves, and dehydration. Entire towns, even in the 1800s, still depended on this trade both economically and for survival. And in China, during the Qing dynasty, salt remained a tightly controlled monopoly. Officials and merchants could become extraordinarily wealthy or lose their heads if they were caught in corruption. Smuggling rings operated in secret, while rural families continued to boil brine in clay pots. Just as their ancestors had for centuries, salt did not simply vanish from relevance in the 19th or even 20th centuries. It merely shifted. With the advent of refrigeration, improved transportation, and industrial food processing, salt's role changed. It was no longer the linchpin of preservation, but it still flavored politics, economies, and lives. Today, when you reach for the salt shaker, it's hard to imagine people branding smugglers or marching through deserts just to obtain a handful. Yet, for much of human history, salt dictated the rise and fall of empires, sparked protest movements, and etched invisible roads across continents. So, what finally brought an end to the Salt Road? It wasn't any single rebellion or decree. It was a slow erosion of industrialization, changing diets, improved preservation methods, and above all, the fading of state monopolies. Governments eventually found more efficient, less incendiary ways to raise revenue. Refrigeration made food preservation easier. Global trade brought competition. What was once a fiercely protected commodity became a common household item. Still, those silent caravans, those smoky salt pans, those long queues at government salt depots remain as ghostly echoes in the dust of forgotten roads. Salt didn't disappear, it just stopped being important in the same way. But its legacy etched into the lives of smugglers, rebels, monarchs, miners, and mothers still lingers. The Salt Road may have ended, but its footprints remain in our kitchens. Our language is worth your salt, and our history, you may ask. In a world where the price of salt is barely noticed, have we forgotten how much effort it once took just to keep food from rotting? Story 4. The Most Boring Rebellion, the Oxfordshire Rising of 1596. Hunger, taxation, and the silent suffering of Tudor peasants. You probably haven't heard of Bartholomew Steer. Very few have. And yet, in 1596, in a country plagued by poor harvests, oppressive taxation, and the shadow of plague, he briefly stood on the edge of a rebellion. It was, perhaps, the quietest rebellion in English history. No castles were stormed, no kings were killed, no songs were sung, but behind it all was something profoundly important: the unbearable weight of poverty. To understand the Oxfordshire Rising, we must first understand the world from which it came. And it wasn't the England of pageants and palaces, but of rotting potatoes, cold fields, and broken backs. The 1590s in England were not easy years. Elizabeth I had ruled for nearly 4 decades. And though the nation had seen some glory, like the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, most common folk did not share in the wealth. The land was gripped by a cold climate anomaly, part of what is now referred to as the Little Ice Age. And while this sounds dramatic, its most significant effects were deeply boring and deeply destructive. Failed harvests, wet summers, bitter winters, and empty barns. By 1596, England had endured 3 bad harvests in a row. Grain prices had soared. Bread, once a daily staple, became a luxury. Even workers who had jobs couldn't afford to feed their families. It was not uncommon for entire communities to survive on nothing but watery pottage, boiled weeds, or the occasional fish caught in a stream. And for those without land laborers, the unemployed, or tenants squeezed by rising rents, it was even worse. This was the context in which Bartholomew Steer lived. He was a carpenter from the village of Hampton Poyle in Oxfordshire, a small, unremarkable settlement just north of Oxford. He wasn't a firebrand, he wasn't rich or powerful. He built furniture and roofs for a living and probably spent most days covered in sawdust and thatch. But Steer, like many others, had grown tired. Not just tired from work, but tired of watching people starve while wealthy landowners profited. What enraged Steer most was the enclosure of common land. Enclosure was one of the slowest revolutions in English history. Wealthy landlords fenced off open fields land that had traditionally been used by villagers to graze animals or gather firewood, and converted them into private pastures, often for sheep. This transformation helped fuel England's emerging wool economy, but left peasants stranded, their livelihoods erased by a simple wooden fence up by the 1590s. Enclosure wasn't new, but its effects were brutal in hard times. Suddenly, the forest where your grandfather had hunted rabbits was off limits. The meadow where your cow once grazed now belonged to a gentleman in London. If you broke the fence, you were charged with trespassing. If you complained, you were accused of sedition. Steer wasn't the only one who noticed. In taverns and fields, whispers of discontent grew louder. Across Oxfordshire and beyond, rumours spread that the Queen's ministers were planning more enclosures, that they cared only for the rich, that something had to be done. And here is where the story becomes quietly rebellious. In the late autumn of 1596, Steer began talking to other labourers, mostly men like him, poor, landless, and increasingly desperate. They met secretly in fields and barns, plotting something they dared not put into writing. Their idea was simple, terrifying, and almost certainly suicidal. They would rise up, but not just protest. No, their plan was to kill. They targeted local gentry specifically, the landowners and justices of the peace responsible for enclosing land or evicting tenants. These men, they believed, were the real enemies of the people, hiding behind the law and robbing the countryside of justice. Steer reportedly planned for the rebels to gather on Inslow Hill near Kidlington, a place known historically for public meetings and fairs. It was a deliberate choice, meant to invoke the memory of ancient traditions and perhaps lend their act the weight of English custom. From there, they would march with pitchforks and scythes, gathering support from other villagers, and begin what they hoped would be a cascade of uprisings across the shires. They would begin to kill the gentlemen, one informant would later say, and they genuinely believed that thousands of starving villagers would join them. But here is where the story of the Oxfordshire Rising takes its defining turn, not with a bang, but with silence. Because this rebellion, like so many forgotten corners of history, never really happened. When the day came to assemble, Steer showed up. So did 3 others. That was it. Just for men. No pitchfork-wielding mobs, no banners, no songs, only a cold hill and the realization that no one else was coming before. The night ended. They were arrested. Word had gotten out. Informants had spoken, and the authorities acted quickly because even a whisper of rebellion, however small, was taken very seriously in Tudor England. Steer and his companions were hauled before the justices and charged not merely with conspiracy but with treason. The authorities wanted to make an example of them. In an age of anxiety, plague, war, harvest failure, the government could not tolerate even the suggestion of unrest. And so the Oxfordshire Rising became officially a rebellion. Though it never saw a battle, never spilled a drop of blood, and never even left the hillside, it was tried as if it were a war. As you imagine this scene, the damp courtrooms, the ink-stained fingers of clerks, the silence of the accused, it might be tempting to think this rebellion was ridiculous, pathetic, even, but that would miss the deeper point. Because the Oxfordshire Rising reveals something far more important about history, that people often break not from ambition or ideology, but from hunger, and that even the quietest protests are born from loud despair. And so, as we leave Steer in the cold custody of the state, the question lingers: what punishment did these 4 men face, and what message did the Crown send to others like them? The Crown's grip and the weight of justice stopped when Bartholomew Steer and his small group of conspirators found themselves under arrest. The full machinery of Tudor law descended upon them with grim efficiency. What began as whispered talk of rebellion on Inslow Hill turned into a serious legal matter, one that the English Crown treated with grave concern. To the rulers of the time, even the smallest hint of unrest was a dangerous threat. England in the 1590s was a land under pressure, beset by poor harvests, outbreaks of plague, and the constant spectre of foreign war with Spain. The stability of Queen Elizabeth I's government, though often portrayed as serene and unshakable, was always more fragile than popular history suggests. Once arrested, Steer and his companions faced charges not merely of rebellion but of treason, a crime punishable by death in Elizabethan England. Treason was considered the highest offense against the Crown itself, the act of betraying the monarch's authority. Their plot, while small and without a single violent act, was interpreted as a conspiracy that threatened the realm's peace. The legal definition of treason at the time was broad and unforgiving, compassing or imagining the death of the sovereign or levying war against the Crown. Though Steer's intentions were arguably aimed at local landlords, the government saw the plan as an attack on the entire system of order. What began as local grievances over land and poverty became transformed in the eyes of the law into a challenge to royal sovereignty. The trial proceedings were swift. Steer and his fellow conspirators were brought before the assize court. Evidence included confessions, some obtained under pressure, and testimonies from informants who had overheard plans or heard rumors. In an era without fair trial standards as we know them today, the accused had little chance to mount a defense. The verdict was predictable: guilty of treason. Punishment for treason was severe and designed to serve as a warning. For men, this usually meant hanging, drawing, and quartering, a gruesome and public spectacle intended to instill fear in others. Historical records do not detail precisely how Steer's punishment was carried out, but it is presumed he faced the full brunt of Tudor justice. It was a sentence meant not only to punish but to erase dissent. Public executions were political theater as much as punishment. Crowds gathered to witness these spectacles. The state's message was clear: rebellion, even the smallest whisper of it, would be crushed. But the Oxfordshire Rising was not an isolated event in the turbulent 1590s. Similar unrest had been simmering in other counties: Yorkshire, Essex, and Kent. All reported food riots, protests over enclosures, and disturbances. That the government responded with a mixture of repression and reform. On the one hand, officials intensified surveillance of rural areas, using local magistrates to root out dissent. On the other hand, some attempts were made to alleviate hardship by regulating grain prices and cracking down on hoarders and profiteers. Yet, these measures often failed to address the underlying issues: climate-induced crop failures, growing inequality, and the erosion of common rights. The Queen's administration remained wary of widespread rebellion, but also recognized that England's social fabric was fraying. The Oxfordshire Rising was a symptom of a muted one of this tension. Because the rebellion was so small and swiftly suppressed, it never found a place in popular memory or grand historical narratives. Steer and his co-conspirators became footnotes, their names barely recorded beyond court transcripts, yet their story speaks volumes about the countless unnamed peasants who struggled in silence. Their grievances, hunger, dispossession, injustice, were shared across the countryside, and it reminds us that history is not only made by kings and battles, but also by quiet desperation and failed hopes. Why was this rebellion so quiet? Unlike the more famous uprisings like the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 or Kett's rebellion in 1549, the Oxfordshire Rising lacked several key elements that might have made it larger. No charismatic leader. Bartholomew Steer was an ordinary man, with no significant influence or following. Poor communication. In an age before modern media, spreading the word was slow and unreliable. Fear. After decades of harsh punishments for dissent, many were afraid to join. Lack of resources. The peasants lacked weapons, money, and organization. The rebellion's failure was perhaps inevitable, but its existence nonetheless signals the depth of rural distress. The Oxfordshire Rising exposes the tension between the evolving Tudor states and the rural poor. It reveals a society grappling with economic transformation, moving from feudal patterns toward early capitalism, privatization of land, and new forms of governance. In this context, enclosure wasn't just about fences, it was about control, exclusion, and survival. The common lands were lifelines for peasants. Losing access meant losing the ability to feed families or supplement meager wages. The Crown's heavy-handed response highlights the priorities of power: maintaining order, protecting property, and suppressing dissent, even if it meant crushing those at the bottom who had the least. As you reflect on this, ask yourself, what might have happened if more people had dared to rise? Would England's social and political landscape have been different? Or would the state's repression have been even more brutal? And what about today? How do governments respond to the silent suffering of the many? Aftermath, legacy, and the quiet persistence of struggle. When the dust settled on the Oxfordshire Rising, the official story was that a minor conspiracy had been swiftly crushed, its instigators punished, and order restored. Yet beneath this seemingly uneventful conclusion lay deeper ripples, echoes of hardship, resistance, and change that persisted long after the four men were taken from the hill. Bartholomew Steer and his small circle became warnings, examples stamped into the collective memory of the Tudor state. Rebellion, no matter how small or desperate, would not be tolerated. For the government, silence was part of the strategy. The Oxfordshire Rising was a quiet affair, easily overshadowed by the grander events of Elizabethan England, naval victories, cultural flourishing, and international intrigue. As such, the rebellion was quickly buried in official records and forgotten by most. But in the villages and farms of Oxfordshire, the memory lingered. Villagers whispered of Steer's courage or recklessness, depending on whom you asked. Parents warned children against talking about such things. The landowners increased their vigilance, reinforcing fences and tightening their hold on the commons. The common people, however, endured. The 1590s were only a chapter in a much longer story of hardship. For England's rural poor, the that had sparked steers' fury did not stop, they accelerated. Landowners increasingly turned pasture to sheep, attracted by the booming wool trade. This shift displaced thousands of tenants and laborers, who often migrated to towns or became seasonal workers. Alongside enclosure came the rise of wage labor and the decline of traditional village life. Communal farming gave way to privatization, and the centuries-old rights to gather wood, graze animals, or fish in common waters were restricted or eliminated. These changes fractured social bonds, increased inequality, and fueled sporadic unrest. Food shortages and famine remained threats. The Little Ice Age continued to bring unpredictable weather. Epidemics struck repeatedly. In this grim context, the Oxfordshire Rising might have been a flicker, but it was part of a broader tapestry of quiet resistance, riots over grain prices, protests against unfair rents, and covert acts of defiance, like poaching or sabotaging fences. While the government cracked down on rebels, it also sought to manage the underlying problems. Legislation was introduced to regulate prices and limit excessive enclosures. Local justices were tasked with enforcing these laws, though often with limited success, as many were themselves landowners profiting from enclosure. The Tudor state also began to develop early poor relief measures, such as the Poor Laws passed in the late 16th century. These laws formalized parish responsibility for the destitute, funded by local taxes. Though imperfect, and often stingy, these laws reflected growing recognition that social stability depended on managing poverty. In many ways, the Oxfordshire Rising and others like it helped to highlight the urgency of these issues, even if they didn't directly cause legislative change. For peasants and laborers, the consequences of enclosure and economic hardship were tangible and painful. Families lost homes or were forced to abandon ancestral lands. Men traveled farther for work, sometimes seasonally or permanently migrating to cities like London. Women and children often bore the brunt of poverty, working as servants or in cottage industries like weaving or spinning to survive. Nutrition suffered. Disease and malnutrition went hand in hand. Yet despite these challenges, communities endured. Shared hardship often strengthened social ties, creating networks of mutual aid, charity, and support. Steer himself vanished from history after his trial and punishment, whether executed, imprisoned, or simply fading into obscurity. His life became emblematic of the forgotten voices of the poor. His attempt at rebellion was unspectacular, and failed, but it was a testament to the desperation faced by those pushed to the margins. In this, his story connects to countless others, unnamed peasants, laborers, and tenants whose quiet struggles shaped the course of English history. The Oxfordshire Rising may not fit into grand historical narratives of wars or kings. It is a story of quiet desperation, a flicker of resistance, born not from ideology but survival. It reveals the tensions at the heart of early modern England, between a centralizing state and local communities, between economic change and social stability, between power and poverty, that asks us to reconsider how history remembers its actors, who gets to be remembered, who is forgotten, and why. In some ways, the Oxfordshire Rising is history's whisper, a reminder that beneath the surface of celebrated events lie countless small stories of endurance, courage, and sometimes failure. And today, as you look around at modern society, it's easy to forget how many struggles, quiet and unseen, shape the world. Poverty, displacement, and economic hardship remain realities for millions. The Oxfordshire Rising may be long past, but its themes resonate. When people are pushed too far, when their basic needs are ignored, rebellion, even the quietest kind, can arise. So, as you drift off from this story, consider what voices go unheard in your own time, what small rebellions flicker quietly beneath the surface, and what does that say about the health of our society? Story 5. The Forgotten Siege, the 1238 fall of Valencia, the city of silk and stone. In the early 13th century, Valencia was one of the richest, most culturally vibrant cities in the Iberian Peninsula. Yet it is rarely remembered in modern history, overshadowed by louder narratives of conquest and glory. It is not the Alhambra, nor is it Cordoba or Granada, but Valencia, then part of Al-Andalus, was a city of enormous consequence. It was a city of gardens, of poets, of scholars, and in 1238, it fell in one of the least dramatized yet most politically strategic sieges of the Reconquista. By then, centuries of warfare had shaped Spain into a checkerboard of Christian and Muslim states. Valencia, ruled by the Tifa kings, was an independent Muslim kingdom that had managed to hold on to its autonomy despite external threats. It had once been seized by El Cid in 1094 but returned to Muslim hands after his death in 1099. From then, until the early 13th century, the city had experienced periods of relative stability, fragile but sustained. The region surrounding Valencia was fertile and wealthy. Its orchards and irrigation systems were among the most advanced in Europe. The city itself was protected by massive stone walls, rebuilt and reinforced after the Almoravid invasions a century earlier. These fortifications, with their double stone and watchtowers, stood as a testament to centuries of siege warfare. But inside the city, life was rich and intricate. Artisans crafted delicate silk and ceramics. Scholars translated classical Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. The city buzzed with the movement of merchants, clerics, and travelers from distant lands. In the cool, tiled courtyards, people recited poetry and debated philosophy. Valencia was a center of Arab science, especially astronomy and medicine, and its libraries housed thousands of manuscripts. The ruling emir in the 1230s was Zayn ibn Mardanish, a noble with military experience but limited resources. He was aware of the storm looming beyond the city walls. King James I of Aragon, known as the Conqueror, was moving southward. James I was tall, deeply religious, and prone to long monologues that confused even his own court. He was a child king, raised amid civil war, and molded by political instability. By the time he turned his attention to Valencia, he had already consolidated power in Aragon and Catalonia. He saw the Muslim-controlled south not only as a religious duty to reclaim but also as a vast opportunity for land and wealth. Still, taking Valencia was not as simple as laying siege. It required patience, alliances, and subtle coercion. Valencia wasn't just a city, it was a symbol of Muslim resilience on the Iberian frontier. James knew the importance of surrounding the city strategically. In 1236, he began laying the groundwork. He strengthened Christian settlements to the north. He entered into uneasy alliances with rebellious Muslim nobles who were enemies of Zion. And perhaps most critically, he targeted the towns and villages surrounding Valencia to sever its supply lines. By early 1237, Zayn understood the gravity of the threat. His scouts reported Christian armies approaching from several directions. Refugees began pouring into the city, farmers, shepherds, artisans, bringing news of nearby towns captured or burned. The city swelled in population, food prices spiked, and rumors flourished. Still, Zayn believed the walls could hold. He gathered his commanders in the Alcázar palace and spoke plainly. The Christian king will not wait forever, he hopes. We will collapse before the siege begins. We must show him we are prepared to outlast him. But the reality was grim. The Tifa of Valencia had no significant allies left. The Almohad Caliphate in North Africa, once powerful, was in collapse. Cordoba had fallen in 1236. Seville would hold out for only a few more years. Zayn was facing a tide that no longer favored the Muslim kingdoms of Iberia. The first skirmishes began in the summer of 1237. Christian forces, under James's command, attacked key villages like El Puig, just north of Valencia. Zayn responded with swift counterattacks, pushing back the Aragonese. For a moment, it appeared that the Muslim forces could hold their ground, but James had no intention of retreating. Instead, he paused, called for reinforcements, and returned with more troops in early 1238. By April, the full siege had begun. James's army encircled Valencia. Trenches were dug, siege engines constructed, and supplies tightly rationed. Rather than launch an immediate assault, James opted for psychological and logistical reasons. He starved the city slowly. Inside the city, the mood changed from confidence to unease. Markets began to close. Bread grew scarce. In the mosque courtyards, people whispered prayers for deliverance. At night, the sound of Christian horns echoed from beyond the walls, accompanied by the dull, rhythmic thud of siege machines testing weaknesses. Zayn doubled the guards along the battlements. He sent urgent letters to distant emirs, pleading for aid, but none came. Valencia, once the shining garden of Al-Andalus, was now a city bracing for slow strangulation. The siege was not just a contest of force, but of endurance. The citizens of Valencia had survived invasions before, but could they survive isolation? How long could the wells hold out? How long before hunger turned to panic? And most of all, could Zayn find a way out that didn't mean total surrender? The turning of the treadwork, justice, and punishment in the millhouses. You have found yourself in the bowels of a 13th century English monastic estate, but not in the quiet stone chapel or herb-scented cloisters. No, you are deep in the drafty underside of a millhouse that is a strange hybrid of sacred economics and sweating punishment. Here, the echo of grinding stone drowns out all philosophical questions, save one: who turns the wheel when no oxen can? In the last section we explored how monastic orders, especially the Cistercians, began to perfect the use of water mills and windmills, not only for grinding grain but as engines of wealth. These mills, essential to the food economy of medieval Europe, quickly became objects of contention. Their importance was both practical and symbolic. To grind was to rule, and rule they did, by millstone. But not all mills were powered by water or wind. Enter the treadmill, the human-powered wheel of labor and judgment. Before the treadmill became the contraption of modern exercise guilt, it was an unyielding apparatus of punishment. The earliest reference to a treadwheel used as a form of penal labor in Europe appears in England around the 14th century, but the inspiration likely came from earlier Roman crane systems, where men walked inside massive wheels to lift weighty stones during construction. In medieval times, this same principle was applied in places like debtors, prisons, and mill houses. These vertical treadmill structures consisted of large wooden drums into which prisoners or laborers stepped, climbing endlessly to turn gears that lifted sacks of grain or drew buckets from wells. Some were even connected to grain grinders, meaning the laborer became the literal engine of food production. These wheels weren't just used to punish, they were a kind of forced participation in the economy. If you owed taxes or committed minor offenses, you might be sent to the wheel, not to rot in a cell, but to work until you'd ground away your debt. It wasn't so much justice as it was accounting by way of muscle and bone. Imagine being told that for every hour you walk in the wheel, you shave a farthing off your fine. The only measure of time, your blistering feet and the creaking drum. The idea of justice in medieval Europe wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was deeply entwined with money or the lack of it. Debtors were particularly susceptible to punitive labor. Unlike today, where bankruptcy is handled on paper, debt in the Middle Ages often had physical consequences. Couldn't pay your tax, couldn't return a borrowed plowshare, off to the treadmill. For the church, this was convenient. The treadmill allowed religious institutions to collect labor in lieu of money, while keeping their moral hands ostensibly clean. It was framed not as punishment, but as penance, a holy suffering that benefited both the sinner and the abbey. How efficient! And while most treadmill laborers weren't hardened criminals, there were exceptions. Thieves, repeat poachers, and even drunkards found themselves sentenced to hours or days on the wheel. The goal wasn't necessarily to break the body, but to humble the spirit. The repetitive nature of the work was seen as soul-cleansing, though one suspects it also kept the flour sacks full. In many towns, the treadwheel was installed right outside the mill, so the townsfolk could watch the condemned at work. Justice, it was believed, should be seen. Curiously, records show that women, too, were subjected to treadmill labor, especially in England and parts of France. While they were less likely to be consigned to physical tasks in fields, women accused of gossiping, brewing ale without a license, or shirking church tithes could find themselves on the justice wheel. A 14th century record from Norfolk details a woman named Marjorie who was forced to walk the wheel for 3 days after spreading rumors about the local priest. Her punishment wasn't just about silencing her, it was also symbolic. By walking in place for hours, she was returned to the path of righteousness. Punishments like these were designed with moral theater in mind. The church wasn't just turning grain, it was turning public opinion. By the 16th century, the tide began to turn against human-powered mills, literally. Advances in watermill technology, combined with growing critiques of forced labor, meant that treadmill justice began to fall out of favor. Besides, the wheels were inefficient compared to draft animals and water power. The Protestant Reformation also played a role. Many reformers such as Martin Luther criticized the blending of spiritual and economic authority. They were particularly scathing toward monastic wealth, which they saw as hypocrisy in a robe. The very mills that once fed the poor and punished the wayward were now seen by some as instruments of greed. In some regions, treadmills remained in use, but increasingly they became associated with prisons rather than monasteries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the treadmill had been rebranded as a symbol of penal reform, used in British prisons to instill discipline through physical repetition. In this new incarnation, the treadmill produced nothing. No flour, no lifted water, no tangible outcome. It existed purely to exhaust and reform. A moral millstone. The story of the medieval treadmill isn't just about the mechanics of labor. It's about how structures of power, religious, economic, and social found ways to legitimize hardship. It reveals a world where turning a wheel wasn't just work, but an act of spiritual alignment or retribution. It's easy to imagine that such practices were distant and crude, part of a forgotten barbarism, but in truth, they were born from a logical system, one where everything had its cost, and every cost had a labor value, even time, even shame. Walking a wheel didn't just pay a debt, it erased a stain, at least in the eyes of those in control. But what did the laborers see, hour after hour, step after step? Did they feel their sins being lifted like sacks of grain, or were they simply counting the turns, waiting to be free of the grind? And so, as the last rays of light stretched through the high windows of a monastic millhouse, casting long shadows across the wooden drum, we are left with this question. When the wheel stops turning, who decides the work is done by the church, the debtor, or the silence that follows? Resistance, subjugation, and the legacy of forgotten frontiers. You've made it to the final stretch of this long and quietly violent tale. In the frigid forests, along the fog-wrapped shores of the Baltic Sea, the crusade dragged on into the 13th century. If the earlier centuries saw the slow rise of Christianity in the lands of fire temples and sacred groves, this last chapter would be one of bitter resistance, creeping submission, and the quiet burial of once vibrant beliefs. As the dust settled from the battles of the sword, brothers and Teutonic knights, the full weight of cultural and spiritual conquest began to take shape. It would not happen quickly, nor smoothly. It would happen the way snow covers a field, gradually, layer upon layer, until the past is silent. Following the consolidation of key territories by the Livonian brothers of the sword and their successors, pagan resistance didn't end, but it grew more fragmented. Tribes like the Curonians and the Samogitians became notorious thorns in the side of the crusading orders. These groups developed guerrilla tactics, striking out from forests and marshes, refusing to accept the authority of foreign bishops and their mailed enforcers. In the mid-13th century, Mindaugas, the Lithuanian duke, saw the writing on the wall. His territories lay directly in the path of the crusading storm. Rather than engage in a hopeless war, he converted to Christianity in 1251 and was crowned king of Lithuania. But it was a political conversion. Many of his nobles and people remained deeply pagan, and after Mindaugas' assassination in 1263, the fragile veneer of Christianity in Lithuania peeled away. The Samogitians continued to resist Christianization until as late as 1413. That's nearly 2 centuries after the First Crusade had already reshaped the Holy Land. To put it another way, while Gothic cathedrals were rising in Paris and the Black Death was winding its way across Europe, Baltic villagers were still holding secret fire rituals deep in the woods. The resistance wasn't just military, it was cultural. Families passed down prayers in whispered tones. Sacred groves were visited at dusk. Wooden idols were buried, not burned, only to be dug up again by later generations. Even after public conversions, many Baltic people practiced dual belief systems, publicly Christian, privately pagan. It's a phenomenon scholars call syncretism, and in the Baltic lands, it was an act of survival. As the bloodshed slowly subsided, a new form of conquest began: administrative colonization. German merchants, clergy, and settlers began to take over the newly pacified territories. Riga, the port city, originally founded as a small trading outpost, grew into a bustling Hanseatic hub. It became a beacon of Germanic culture, wealth, and architectural ambition. Surrounded by conquered territories populated by subdued natives, monasteries were built not just as places of worship, but as outposts of education, taxation, and surveillance. Latin became the language of record. Local Baltic languages were suppressed or ignored. Land ownership was reorganized under a feudal model, with crusading knights now becoming landlords and local peasants reduced to tenants. The Teutonic knights in Prussia went further. They constructed towering brick fortresses like the one at Malberg at the time, the largest castle in the world. These castles weren't just military structures. They were psychological monuments meant to project dominance, permanence, and the notion that this land now belonged to the Christian West. Yet beneath the stones, resistance lingered. There were periodic revolts. One of the largest came in 1260 after the Samogitians defeated the Teutonic Order at the Battle of Derb. It inspired widespread uprisings across the Baltic territories, but these rebellions were often crushed with ruthless efficiency. The message was clear: obedience or obliteration, Christianization or erasure. With power solidified, the crusading orders began their work of spiritual transformation, or, as some historians argue, cultural erasure. Pagans were forcibly baptized, sacred sites were desecrated or replaced with churches, priests were installed in villages where nobody spoke Latin or understood the Gospels, but understanding wasn't necessary, obedience was. For many Baltic villages, religion became a language of control. Some areas were more resilient. In rural Lithuania, ancient practices held on through folk songs, seasonal rituals, and coded celebrations. The Catholic Church, seeing the difficulty of total transformation, began to absorb certain pagan customs. The celebration of Ios, a Lithuanian Christmas Eve dinner, retained pagan elements like straw under the table and leaving out food for ancestral spirits. But the spiritual landscape was changing irreversibly. Wooden idols were replaced with crucifixes. Local festivals were rebranded as Christian holidays. And slowly, generation by generation, the knowledge of the old ways faded into fragments, stories, and silence. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the tides began to turn against the monastic military orders themselves. Their power had reached a peak and, like many empires, they began to overreach. In 1410, the Teutonic Knights faced their greatest defeat at the Battle of Grunwald, also known as Tannenberg. A coalition of Polish and Lithuanian forces crushed the order, ending its dream of further expansion. Though the Knights retained control of some territory afterward, their political and military dominance waned sharply by 1525. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Albert of Brandenburg, did something unthinkable. He converted to Lutheranism during the Protestant Reformation and secularized the order's lands into the Duchy of Prussia. The sword had finally become the pen, or more precisely, the tax ledger. Ironically, the last holdout of Baltic paganism had outlasted the military crusaders who once terrorized the region in the name of faith. Today, the Baltic countries Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are fully modern European nations. Churches dot the landscape, and Christianity remains the dominant religion. Yet, deep in the cultural DNA of the region, the old stories still stirred on the 19th and 20th centuries. Baltic nationalists rediscovered their pre-Christian roots as a source of pride and identity. Folklore collections blossomed, ancient symbols reappeared in art. Some even revived old rituals in symbolic form. Solstice festivals, songs to nature, respect for the forest. There's also a slow and quiet academic reckoning with the legacy of the Baltic Crusades. Unlike the romanticized Holy Land Crusades, the Baltic campaigns are increasingly recognized as violent colonial projects masked in religious garb. The missionaries weren't always peaceful, the knights weren't always noble, and the pagans, those mysterious forest-dwelling people, weren't backward, they were simply different. Perhaps that's the dull yet profound truth of history. The winners write the records, but the whispers of the conquered never vanish. They remain in the soil, in the stories, and in the strange survival of the small. And so ends our long walk through the Baltic Crusades. Not with a grand charge, nor with a dramatic betrayal, but with silence. A silence broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant echoes of chants in a language no longer spoken. But one must ask, what was truly lost when the last fire temple was extinguished? Was it merely belief, or something deeper about how humans once lived with the land? Story 6. The Great Hedgehog War of Falkland Island, 1980 to 2000. A furry invasion begins. You wouldn't expect a conservation disaster to start with something so small and spiky. But in the late 20th century, on a remote chain of islands known mostly for sheep, penguins, and long-standing geopolitical tensions, a war of a very different kind broke out. One not waged with bullets, but with hedgehogs. Yes, hedgehogs. The Falkland Islands, situated in the South Atlantic Ocean about 300 miles east of the southern tip of South America, had long remained one of the more isolated and quiet parts of the world. Administered by the British but claimed by Argentina, the islands had been the site of conflict in the past, most famously the Falklands War of 1982. But the conflict at the heart of this story wouldn't make international headlines, nor would it change borders. It would, however, change an ecosystem. To understand what happened, we need to look first at what made the Falklands so ecologically unique. Prior to human settlement, the islands had no native land mammals. Birds thrived, particularly ground-nesting seabirds like petrels and penguins. Over millennia, With no mammalian predators to contend with, these birds evolved in ways that left them uniquely vulnerable. They built nests on the ground. In the open, their eggs and chicks were often left unattended, relying on the assumption that nothing with claws and teeth would disturb them. This worked just fine, until humans showed up. By the late 19th century, settlers on the islands had begun importing animals both deliberately and accidentally. Cats, rats, and mice all found their way onto the islands, but it wasn't until the 1980s that one small, seemingly harmless creature would tip the scales in a surprising way. Erinarchos europaeus, the European hedgehog. Why hedgehogs? The reasons, as is often the case in history, were surprisingly mundane. Some sources suggest that hedgehogs were introduced to certain gardens by well-meaning residents, who thought them charming or helpful in keeping insect populations down. Others suspect they may have arrived as stowaways on ships, tucked away in cargo holds and crates. Either way, by the early 1980s, small populations of hedgehogs had begun to appear around the settlements on the larger islands. At first, nobody paid much attention. Hedgehogs, after all, were not known for being invasive predators. In Britain, they were considered beneficial to gardens, consuming slugs, beetles, and other pests. Children adored them. They were featured in children's books and cuddly toys. What harm could they do? Quite a lot, it turned out. The Falklands hedgehogs, like their British cousins, had a taste for insects, but in the absence of sufficient insects, they developed a taste for something else. Bird eggs, particularly the eggs of the native seabirds that nested along the low coastal plains of the islands. By the late 1980s, researchers had begun to notice that in areas where hedgehogs had been sighted, seabird colonies were in decline. The nests were being disturbed. Eggs were vanishing. Some areas once teeming with breeding birds were becoming eerily quiet. Still, it took years for the problem to be fully understood. Hedgehogs are nocturnal, shy, and solitary. Unlike rats or cats, they didn't cause visible destruction or interact much with humans. Their spiny coats gave them a somewhat comical appearance, which further obscured the danger they posed. In ecological terms, they were a cryptic invasive species, one that blends in so well it's easy to miss the damage until it's too late. By the early 1990s, environmental scientists began to ring the alarm bell. They documented the spread of hedgehog populations in several of the Falklands Western Islands. In particular, they noted a clear overlap between hedgehog range and seabird nesting failure. Species like the Magellanic penguin and the southern giant petrel, which had once flourished, were now struggling. But how, exactly, had a species that weighs just a couple of pounds and has the disposition of a sleepy pincushion become such an effective predator? The answer, as always, lay in ecological imbalance. The Falklands had no natural predators to keep hedgehog populations in check. Their spines protected them from dogs or cats. Their small size and nocturnal habits allowed them to roam freely, sneaking into nests at night and devouring entire clutches of eggs in a single sitting. Worse still, hedgehogs were highly adaptable. They began expanding their range each year, establishing new breeding populations and pushing further into the interior of the islands. To the untrained eye, all seemed calm on the Falklands, but among conservationists and ecologists, it was becoming clear the islands were under siege. The British Antarctic Survey and several universities from the UK began conducting studies to assess the damage. What they found shocked them. In some areas, nest success rates for native seabirds had dropped by over 70%. Entire colonies had been abandoned. A once thriving ecosystem was falling silent, one nest at a time. And still, many on the islands were reluctant to take action. Hedgehogs were cute. The problem seemed abstract. Surely a few small animals couldn't be causing that much harm. The challenge wasn't just ecological, it was psychological. How do you convince people to wage war on an animal that looked more like a stuffed toy than an invader? The battle lines were drawn, but not between predator and prey, between conservationists and complacency, between scientific evidence and public perception. And so, by the mid-1990s, the Falklands Hedgehog War had truly begun, not with guns or bombs, but with debates in council chambers, field reports from bird researchers, and early morning stakeouts by ecologists trying to count tiny footprints in the sand. But could they stop the invasion before it was too late? And how do you remove a creature from an ecosystem it never belonged to without making things even worse? That question, unresolved, thorny, and still emotionally charged, would dominate the next phase of this strange and quiet conflict. The grain crisis and urban decay. You wake in the dim light of a Roman morning, sometime in the early 5th century. The streets of Rome, once bustling with traders, chariots, philosophers, and foreign emissaries, feel eerily still. You hear the clatter of sandals, but it's no longer the footsteps of merchants or Roman legions. It's the slow tread of the unemployed, wandering through alleys and forum ruins, searching not for philosophy but for bread. At the heart of the Western Roman Empire's slow unraveling was a quiet, yet insidious force. The grain crisis. That economy of Rome had long depended on a triad of essential imports: grain, olive oil, and wine. Of these, grain was paramount. The empire had spent centuries developing vast logistical systems to ensure that food flowed from its most fertile provinces, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, into the bellies of citizens in Rome and beyond. But by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, that flow had become a trickle. When you trace the story of Roman grain, you begin to understand that this isn't just about food, it's about power, infrastructure, and the delicate balance of empire. The Roman unknown system, a kind of ancient welfare mechanism, ensured that eligible citizens, especially in Rome, received free or heavily subsidized grain from the state. For centuries, this program was a cornerstone of civic identity and stability. It was more than food. It was a promise that Rome would care for its people. It was also an implicit bargain in exchange for loyalty and order. The emperor would provide the basics of life, but cracks had started forming. As the Western Empire lost control of North Africa to the Vandals by the mid-5th century, the grain supply lines were severed. This wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was catastrophic. Imagine an empire trying to function while its capital starved. The granaries sat increasingly empty. The once reliable merchant fleets dwindled, either requisitioned for defense or sunk by piracy. Local production, never sufficient to feed the teeming city of Rome, was burdened with expectations it could not fulfill. Provincial estates that once exported surplus now struggled to maintain themselves as slave labor dwindled and transportation routes crumbled. You might ask, why couldn't Rome adapt? Couldn't they farm closer to the capital? That's where the other slow-burn economic disasters begin to show. As the imperial economy weakened, rural depopulation became widespread. Wealthy landowners, the senatorial elites, began withdrawing from public life, investing less in communal infrastructure and more in self-sustaining estates. These latifundia, massive landholdings, operated like miniature kingdoms. Their owners were no longer interested in exporting grain to the cities. Instead, they hoarded it, traded locally, or used it to support their private militias and household retainers. So while food still existed in parts of the empire, access to it became political and personal. Distribution was broken. The effects on urban life were devastating. Cities across the empire, particularly in the west, began to shrink. Archaeological evidence from places like Trier, Londinium, London, and even Rome itself suggests that large sections of once bustling neighborhoods fell into disuse. Baths dried up, aqueducts cracked, markets were abandoned, public services collapsed. The urban poor, once reliant on state-sponsored bread, were either forced to migrate to rural estates where they would become semi-servile tenants, or starved in the crumbling shells of once great cities. This migration marked the beginning of a new social order. The free Roman citizens slowly gave way to the coloni, a class of tenant farmers who, though technically free, were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their landlord's permission. Over the next century, this class would become the basis of medieval serfdom. But let's return to Rome, the eternal city. By the early 400s, Rome had already been sacked once by the Visigoths in 410. The psychological impact of that event was massive, but in terms of physical and administrative damage, it was merely a harbinger. The real devastation came with continued economic stagnation. Imagine the Forum Romanum, its columns chipped and fading, no longer echoing the voices of senators debating the fate of provinces. Instead, goats graze among the weeds. The Aemilia, once a proud structure of commerce, is used by squatters. Public latrines overflow, uncleaned. The Cloaca Maxima, the city's ancient sewer, chokes with debris. Even the grandeur of the Roman monuments becomes a source of decay. With state-funded construction and maintenance a thing of the past, scavengers chip away at marble facades, repurposing them as building material for makeshift homes. Bronze clamps holding stones together are ripped out and melted down for tools or weapons. The shrinking urban populations had another effect. Tax revenues collapsed. The Roman tax system was notoriously regressive and bureaucratically complex. The state placed immense burdens on small landholders and municipal councils to extract revenue. not only for maintaining the army but for supporting imperial court life, infrastructure, and bribes to hostile or semi-hostile barbarian kings. Fewer people to tax, and declining productivity in agriculture and trade, the system cannibalized itself. Entire towns petitioned to be relieved of curial duties. Desperate for labor and revenue, emperors passed edicts freezing people in their professions and tying them to their land, further eroding social mobility. Bartering became increasingly common as coinage lost value or disappeared from circulation. Altogether, gold, while still prized, no longer greased the wheels of daily life. In the provinces, local economies operated on favors, livestock, or produce, resembling the barter economies of pre-imperial societies. A telling example comes from Britain. By the early 5th century, Roman Britain was abandoned by the central administration. The local population, accustomed to Roman military support and imports, was suddenly on its own. Villas and towns were deserted or repurposed. Commerce collapsed. What followed was not merely a political vacuum but an economic regression into self-sufficient tribalism throughout the West. As economic centralization vanished, so too did the cultural cohesion that had once defined the empire. Local identities strengthened. Christianity, already ascendant, became the new unifying force. But even it splintered into regional expressions of belief. And yet, it's important to recognize that this collapse was not instant, nor was it uniform. In some areas, particularly in the East, the Roman economy continued to function and even thrive. Constantinople remained a glittering center of trade and culture, but for the western half of the empire, the damage was already too deep. By the time the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, the empire had already functionally ceased to exist. No armies came to avenge him. No senators wept openly in the forum. The imperial system was a ghost, already buried beneath the rubble of economic stagnation, lost grain ships, and hollowed-out cities still. One wonders what might have happened if the grain routes had held, if the economy had adapted sooner, if Rome had focused less on military expansion and more on internal development. As we drift into the final section of this story, the question lingers: did Rome fall because it was invaded or because it had already collapsed from within, long before the final blow? The shadows of centralization, reforms, resistance, and a waning empire. You sit with the scroll in your lap, the voices of a centuries-old bureaucracy drifting quietly in your mind. We've followed the rising tension that fermented during the Sultan Iron debates, and now we arrive at the final stretch of this strange but meaningful historical episode, one where fiscal policies, ideology, and governance silently shaped the fate of an empire. It is now the final years of Emperor Zhao's reign. The empire has been administered through Confucian ideals, yet economically governed by legalist policies, a contradiction that many felt but few dared to question outright. The Sultan Iron monopolies, originally created to finance military expansions and keep northern borders secure from the Zhongnu, now bore down heavily on merchants, local artisans, and even peasants. What had been designed to fund a prosperous state had instead contributed to economic stagnation in rural areas and rampant corruption in government supply chains. By 81 BCE, many of the ideas proposed during the original debates began to manifest in new reforms, or at least attempts at reform. After the debates, a partial rollback of monopolies occurred. The Confucian faction, despite not winning the debates in any formal sense, had managed to plant enough seeds of doubt to force the court to reconsider the breadth of its centralized economic controls. The government began scaling back some of its more extreme policies. For instance, small-scale private ironworks were once again allowed in some provinces, particularly in the southern regions where transporting state iron was both inefficient and costly. Salt, however, remained under firm government control. It was simply too valuable to relinquish, and salt revenues continued to fund military campaigns, as well as palace construction and administrative salaries. These reversals, limited as they were, did not come easily. There were factional disputes within the court. Legalist administrators, deeply entrenched in the state bureaucracy, were loath to give up power. Meanwhile, Confucian scholars lacked the managerial experience to replace them effectively. This created a sort of institutional standoff, with no strong, unifying reforms fully realized. The Han bureaucracy developed a reputation for inefficiency masked by ideological conformity. Meanwhile, in the provinces, the contradictions became ever more apparent. A blacksmith in Shu province might now legally operate a furnace, but they still had to compete with lower cost, subsidized state iron. Peasant families attempting to earn supplemental income through salt harvesting along coastal flats were harassed by tax officials for violating the monopoly. The central government wanted to be both a merchant and a regulator, and in the end, failed at both. What's fascinating, though dry and almost invisible to those not looking closely, is how the debate's aftermath subtly influenced future political philosophy in China. While Confucianism remained the dominant moral and educational ideology, legalism quietly remained the machinery that powered the state. This duality, some might call it hypocrisy, became a fixture in Chinese governance for centuries to come. Governments would often preach Confucian values while practicing legalist strategies, especially in times of crisis. The salt and iron debates thus served not just as a political argument, but as a blueprint for ruling through contradiction. It's also worth noting that many historians consider the debates an early example of the intellectual autonomy granted to civil servants in China. Unlike in many ancient empires where dissent was dangerous, Honora China allowed its scholars to question the emperor's policies, albeit within a controlled setting. This tradition of bureaucratic discourse would echo through the Tang and Song dynasties and even find muted expression during the Ming and Qing. But did the debates actually fix anything? That's a harder question. Economically, the empire remained in a state of uneven growth. Some regions flourished under relaxed policies, while others suffered under continued central control. The government's ability to tax and extract wealth became more sophisticated, but so too did evasion and corruption. In effect, the policies raised just enough revenue to sustain the empire, but not enough to significantly improve conditions for the average citizen. Over time, this imbalance eroded public trust. Local uprisings, not yet widespread rebellions, became more frequent. Grain shortages, inflation, and dissatisfaction with taxation brewed under the surface. It wasn't a boiling over point yet, but the kettle had certainly been left on the fire. There is something strangely quiet about the legacy of the salt and iron debates. No great battles were fought. No famous generals or charismatic revolutionaries emerged. Instead, it was an affair of ink and bamboo, of scrolls and deliberations, of polite disagreement and veiled contempt. And yet, those polite disagreements led to centuries of mixed governance strategies and a deeply complicated relationship between state control and economic freedom. Perhaps that's what makes this so compelling. Real change often comes not with revolutions, but with policies. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the administrative ones. Boring, yes, but foundational. The final lesson of this era may be about balance. The Han Empire, though it survived long after Emperor Zhao's reign, would later crumble under the weight of internal corruption, peasant revolts, and a bloated bureaucracy. But the seeds of those issues were planted here in these policies, these monopolies, these debates. And now, as you rest your eyes, consider this. What happens when a state that speaks in the voice of ethics rules with the hand of power? And what becomes of a people when those who govern them are caught in the tension between ideals and necessity? History doesn't always answer with clarity. Sometimes, it only whispers from the margins. Story 7. The Year Without Sun. A Mother's Silent Farewell, Scandinavia. Year 536 AD. The sky had not turned blue in months. A strange darkness loomed over the forests. Not quite night, but never day either. The sun, when it did rise, was no more than a dull orange disk, barely piercing the thick, ghostly haze that covered the earth. Crops had failed, livestock were dying, and the rivers ran sluggish, and brown. Elyar stood at the edge of the pine forest, her fingers wrapped tightly around the antler-carved pendant hanging from her neck. She was in her late 30s, though. The weathering of grief and work made her look older. Her once shining flaxen hair was now dull and tied into a knot that had not been undone in days. Her skin was pale and tired, like the land itself. Behind her stood her daughter, Solveig, 17 and full of restless dreams, ready to leave their village of Holmsund for a distant hole in the south where the Jarls were said to have better food and hope for survival. "Are you certain you must go?" Elja asked, her voice hoarse from the cold and 100 unspoken fears. Solveig nodded, her eyes shining not from joy, but from purpose. "If I stay, we both will starve. But if I go, I can send back grain. I can send coin, maybe even meat." Elja turned away, so her daughter wouldn't see the tears collecting in her eyes. What Elja and the rest of the northern tribes did not yet know was that a volcano likely in Iceland had erupted months earlier, throwing ash into the stratosphere. It wasn't just their village. All across Europe and even far into Asia, the sun had dimmed. Temperatures plummeted, and harvests failed. Snow fell in China during summer. In Constantinople, people spoke of omens and the wrath of God. But in Holmsland, they simply suffered in silence. Already that year, Elger had buried 2 sons, one taken by a fever, the other by a starving bear desperate enough to come into the village. Her husband had perished 2 winters ago, slipping into the frozen river during a hunt. Salvig was all she had left. I raised you with stories of the gods, Elger whispered. I told you how Freya fought for her people, how mothers must sacrifice to protect the future, but I never imagined the cost would be you. Solveig wrapped her fur cloak tighter around her shoulders. You gave me life, Mama. I want to use it for us both. The village was nearly deserted now. Many had left in groups, heading east or south in search of warmer lands or mercy from kings. Others had not made it through the long nights of the darkened year. That morning, Elger prepared Salveig's bag, with what little they had left. 2 pieces of dried fish, a block of hard cheese, and a pouch of barley grains. She folded in a small wooden carving of a raven Odin's messenger to watch over her daughter. It will protect you when I cannot, she said, pressing it into Solveig's hand at the hearth. The fire barely flickered. The wood they had gathered was damp and rotted. Outside, snow began to fall, though it was mid-July. Salveig glanced at her mother, her heart torn between the desperate need to leave and the longing to stay. I can come back in the spring. Once things are better, Elger gave a thin smile. We have not seen spring in 2 years. Go now, while you still have strength in your legs. When Solveig finally turned and walked down the path that wound between the blackened trees and abandoned huts, Elger stood at the door until she was nothing but a small shape swallowed by snow and smoke. Then, and only then, did Elger collapse to her knees and weep. The pendant around her neck, the last thing her husband had given her, swung wildly as sobs shook her thin body. She pressed her forehead against the cold earth, as if begging it to take her pain and do something with it. She had spent every waking moment shielding her daughter from the worst, feeding her first, warming her with her own cloak, pretending that food was coming soon, that this darkness would lift. Now she had nothing to protect, and no one to protect her. The house felt like a tomb. That night, Elger dreamt of her mother's voice. In the dream, she was a child again, sitting by the hearth as the flames danced and the wind howled outside. Even in the longest winter, her mother whispered, "The earth remembers the sun." When she awoke, Elger felt no warmth, no hope, but she did feel resolved. She would wait. She would endure. If her daughter could survive the journey, then so could she. And perhaps, just perhaps, the gods would give them one more spring. Historians now believe that the events of 536 AD marked one of the most devastating periods in recorded history. A mysterious fog darkened skies across the northern hemisphere, caused by massive volcanic eruptions. This led to a drop in global temperatures by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, failed crops across Europe and Asia, widespread famine and plague in places like Scandinavia. Entire villages disappeared, and oral traditions speak of long winters and vanished summers. The story of Elger and Solveig is fictional, but it reflects the real choices millions had to make, to stay and risk death, or leave everything behind in search of survival. The silent death of summer, the darkness never lifted. Days bled into one another, each grayer than the last. The villagers of Ulfsted awoke every morning praying to the sky for warmth, for light, for a sign that the sun had not abandoned them. But the heavens remained closed, veiled by an endless shroud of ash and sorrow. Eirik stood on the edge of the frost-bitten fields. Once, they had been golden with barley and bright with sunflowers. Now they were pale, lifeless, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. He gripped the fur collar of his cloak, staring at the sky that refused to break. "Still no light?" asked Ingrid softly behind him. He shook his head. Not even a crack in the clouds. She moved beside him, her hand finding his. It was trembling. "I saw Bjorn's wife at the river this morning," Ingrid said. She wept. "Their youngest died last night." Eirik's face hardened. "That's the 3rd this week." It was hunger, and cold, and despair. The smoke from the volcano in the far lands, or so travelers said, had reached their skies. Some claimed it was the wrath of the gods. Others believed the end times had begun. But no explanation changed the truth. The world was growing colder, crops refused to grow, and people were beginning to die. By midsummer, if it could even be called that anymore, the village of Ulfsted had lost its voice. Children no longer played in the square. The once bustling markets stood silent, shutters closed, barrels empty. Eirik stood in front of the longhouse with the village elders. His breath steamed in the air, though it was July. "We cannot feed everyone," said Grettir, the oldest among them, his beard crusted with frost. "Our stores won't last through winter, not even half the season." "We've rationed all we can," Eirik said. "I've cut my own portion by half." "You are the Jarl now," Grettir reminded him. "A leader must eat to lead." Eirik didn't answer. Leadership tasted like ash these days. "We must send some away," another elder said, "to the forests. Let them hunt." Eirik looked at him sharply. "Into the woods. With what? We have no arrows left. No salt to preserve meat. Do you send them to hunt, or to die quietly?" No one replied, because the truth was, survival now meant sacrifice. That night, as the wind howled around their hall and the fire sputtered weakly in the hearth, Ingrid brought out a bundle wrapped in cloth. She laid it gently on the table. Eirik frowned. "What's this?" She hesitated. "I went to the far barn, my father's old one. Hidden in the walls, I found this." She unwrapped it to reveal sacks of barley and dried apples. "Old but still good. Why didn't you say anything earlier?" he asked, voice hushed. "I didn't know if it was real or just hoping to play tricks," she whispered. "And I was afraid if the others find out." Eirik looked at the food as though it were treasure. "This could save the children. We could also hide it," she said. "Keep it only for us." There it was, the question that haunted every man and woman in the village. Help others and risk losing everything, or hoard and ensure your own blood survives. Ingrid looked at him, her eyes glistening. "You decide, Eirik." He stared at the fire, silent for a long time. "We share it," he said at last. "A little to each family." Quietly, she nodded. "That's why I love you." He smiled bitterly. "Even love feels like luxury now." 3 days later, a horn sounded on the northern path. It was weak, barely audible, but it sent ripples through the village. Visitors had become rare and nearly extinct. Eirik approached the gate, hand on his worn axe. Behind him, a dozen villagers gathered in silence, wrapped in furs and suspicion. A man staggered into view, tall, gaunt, wrapped in a wolf-pelt cloak that hung loosely on his starved frame. His eyes were sunken, beard thick with snow and blood. "I seek fire," he rasped, "and bread." "Name yourself," Eirik commanded Ivar of the Ice Coast. The man replied, "What remains of it? What happened there?" Grettir asked. "The sea froze. The fish vanished. My village turned on itself. I left when the old began to die, so the young could eat." His voice cracked. "Then the young died too." Eirik's heart clenched. Another village lost. Another tale of quiet collapse. "You can stay a night," Eirik said. "No promises. Beyond that," Ivar nodded. "One night is more than I had." That night, Eirik held a gathering in the great hall. Word of Ingrid's hidden food had already spread, though neither of them had said a word. Hunger sharpened instincts, and nothing remained secret for long in a starving village. Eirik stood before them all, farmers, hunters, mothers with hollow cheeks and fathers who had sold their last goats for grain. "I have no lies left to give you," he said. "The world has changed. Maybe forever. The warmth we knew may never return. The gods are silent. The sky is cold." Silence. "We found food," he said. A gasp rippled through the room. "It's not much," he added, "but enough to stretch for 2 more weeks if we ration wisely." A murmur grew. Hope, doubt, desperation. "We share it," he said firmly. "All of us." An old woman near the fire cried softly. A child clapped once, unsure why. Then someone stood. It was Eriksson, the blacksmith. "And when that's gone," Eirik met his eyes, "then we fight the cold together, or die together. But we do not become beasts. Not while I am still drawing breath." A silence fell, this time one of respect. The days that followed were sharper, colder. Snow fell even as autumn approached. The ash in the air made it dark, and the cold turned it into razor-thin frost. Birds vanished. Wolves crept closer. One morning Eirik found Ivar at the edge of the village, speaking to the trees. "What do you seek?" he asked. Ivar turned, eyes haunted. "I listen. For the forest speaks clearer than men now." "What does it say?" "That this is not over. The darkness may stretch for years. Then will endure years." Ivar smiled. Painfully. "You are brave, Eirik. Brave men don't always live long, but they leave something behind," Eirik said. "Something worth living for." But not all hearts remained loyal. One night, the storehouse was broken into. The last of the dried apples were stolen. Panic gripped the village like a vice. Eirik gathered everyone who did this, No one answered, not even a breath. He knew. Accusing someone could break what fragile unity remained, but silence was just as deadly. Then a child spoke. It was Halder. All eyes turned to the young man. His face went pale. My sister was dying, he said. She was crying from hunger. I couldn't listen anymore. He fell to his knees. I only took a little. Eirik felt his rage boiling, but beside it, sorrow. You broke our bond, he said. But you are still one of us. He turned to the others. What shall we do? Exile him. Someone said no, Eirik said. He stays. But he does not eat tonight, and he helps rebuild the storehouse. There were murmurs, some in protest, others in agreement, but no one left. No one attacked. Even in the darkest year of human memory, there was still room for justice, for mercy. In the shadow of the year 536, when the world seemed to fall apart, Eirik chose to stand for hope. Each day was a battle, not only for food or warmth but for the soul of his people. And as the ash continued to fall from the grey, ancient skies, something fragile and rare still flickered and yawsted, a belief that light might return, even if it came slowly, even if it came only after everything else had been lost. The final reckoning, the journey to Constantinople, was not just a test of strength, but of spirit. Tormund's boots were worn through by the time he reached the capital's outer gates. His face had grown thinner, his hair darker with ash and soot. From hundreds of campfires, the sun still barely lit the sky, casting an unholy twilight over the city's golden domes. The skies of 536 had not brightened. He wasn't alone. Thousands of ragged figures crowded the capital, praying for salvation, food, warmth. The emperor's city stood defiant, but even its famed stores were shrinking. Bread lines stretched into angry mobs. Rumors ran like wildfire. The Emperor Justinian was summoning holy men, scientists, and sages from all corners of the world. Desperate to understand the curse that had dimmed the heavens, Tormund had something. None of them did. He was brought into the city after 3 days of waiting. His scroll in hand, the chronicles of the horror in the north. As he entered the hippodrome's rear halls, he passed silent mosaics of the emperor's past and a burning incense that clung to his skin. Constantinople was grand, but broken like a once mighty tree hollowed by fire. In a grand chamber sat a man cloaked in imperial purple, Justinian himself. The emperor's eyes bore the weight of an empire, his once robust frame hollowed by worry. You bring words from the edge of the world? Justinian asked, voice brittle as the winter frost. Tormund bowed, unfurling the scrolls. I bring truth from Gaul, from the woods of Germania and the hills of the north. I bring the voices of those who cannot speak anymore. Justinian listened as the chronicles were read aloud. The sunless skies, the starving villagers, the northern tribes who believed Ragnarok had begun, and the old Roman soldiers who still defended ruins in blind loyalty. He listened, not as an emperor, but as a man frightened and furious. There are whispers, Justinian said after a long pause, of a mountain in the far east, one that spewed darkness into the sky. Tormund had heard it too, murmured by Chinese monks in Alexandria before they vanished. Some believe it was punishment, he said, others that it was the sky dying. The emperor rose, staring out a high window. Rome once fell from arrogance. This time, the world may fall from something as simple as ash. Days passed. Tormund remained in the city, observing a court drowning in fear. Bishops declared the darkness a sign of the end times. Scientists argued over natural disasters. The common people feared famine more than any theological debate. Tormund found solace in the Hagia Sophia. There, beneath its massive dome, a monk, named Father Ambrosius, listened without judgment. You have seen death, traveler, the monk said one night, as they sat among flickering candles. I have, Tormund replied, his voice rough. But worse than death is watching those you love die and knowing you cannot save them. Ambrosius nodded. In the year 536, the Lord has hidden his face, but perhaps it is not punishment. Perhaps it is a question. A question, Tormund echoed. Yes, said the monk. Will we tear each other apart in fear, or build something worthy of the light's return? Winter arrived, harsher than ever. Riots erupted near the docks. Merchants refused to sell grain unless paid in gold. The city's poor, many of whom had come from distant lands like Tormund, were left to starve. One morning, a body was found near the aqueduct of Valens. A young girl, frozen, arms curled around her younger brother. Tormund could no longer bear it. He began to speak in the squares, using his soldier's voice, telling stories not of doom but of survival. He spoke of the northern village, where strangers shared roots from the frozen earth. Of a Roman centurion who broke bread with a Saxon, of a little girl who sang even when her mother died because hope, she said, was the only thing they couldn't eat. People listened, some cried, some prayed, and soon something remarkable began. Bakeries reopened, giving bread to the sick, merchants lowered prices, even the palace guards brought blankets from the barracks for orphaned children. Torment. A man with nothing had stirred something the emperor's gold could not compassion. It was a morning like the others, cold, silent, grey. Tormund stood on the city walls, watching the Bosphorus glimmer like black glass. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer, a blush of color in the east. He blinked, thinking it was a trick, but the shimmer grew, and then came the faintest warmth. People emerged from homes, rubbing their eyes, shielding their faces. Children pointed upward, for the first time in over a year. The sun was visible, pale, weak, but there, a cheer rose across Constantinople, spreading like wildfire. Bells rang, church doors opened, priests wept. Tormund stood frozen, unable to move, tears rolling down his cheeks. It wasn't the full sun, but it was something. Hope. Tormund never returned to Gaul. He remained in the capital, where the emperor had his chronicles copied and distributed across the empire. The year 536 would be remembered not only for the dark skies and famine, but for the awakening of the human spirit. The Eastern Empire would face plague, invasions, and more darkness in years to come, but it would remember that even in the worst of times, one voice could spark 1,000 candles. Tormund lived the rest of his days as a humble teacher, guiding others not with weapons, but with stories. The most powerful weapon of all. In the margins of one surviving scroll, a monk scribbled a note. This was the year the sun forgot, but we did not forget how to be human.